Before you settle in tonight, I would love to know where you are listening from. If you feel comfortable, write in the comments the city you are in and the time on your clock as this quiet journey begins. Maybe it is late evening where you are. Maybe the room is already dark. Maybe the world outside your window has grown still. Or maybe you are listening from a busy place, letting this ancient sea carry you gently away from the noise of the present. Wherever you are, and whatever hour has found you, allow yourself to rest. Tonight, we travel to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, to a narrow strip of coast pressed between mountains and sea. There, long before the rise of Rome, long before the marble ambitions of classical Greece, long before the Mediterranean became a Roman lake, a people of sailors, merchants, artisans, and city builders learned how to turn limitation into power. They did not rule a vast land empire. They did not march across continents with endless armies. They did not leave behind one single kingdom with a simple story and a single capital. Instead, they lived in cities. They lived by harbors. They lived by cedar forests, purple dye workshops, temples, markets, and the patient mathematics of wind and tide. They were the Phoenicians. To the Greeks they were known as Phoenicians, a word often connected with the deep red or purple color for which their craftsmen became famous. To themselves, they were not necessarily one unified nation in the modern sense. They were people of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, Beirut, and other coastal cities, bound together by language, gods, customs, trade, and the restless sea. Their homeland lay mostly in what is now Lebanon, with influence reaching into parts of modern Syria. It was not wide, but it was perfectly placed. Behind them rose the Lebanon mountains, rugged and forested in antiquity, filled with the cedar trees prized by kings from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Before them opened the Mediterranean, a broad blue road stretching westward toward Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, Spain, and beyond. The Phoenicians became one of the great maritime peoples of the ancient world. They carried goods, stories, gods, technologies, scripts, and habits of exchange from shore to shore. They founded colonies and trading stations across the Mediterranean. They helped spread an alphabetic writing system that would influence Greek, Latin, and many later scripts. They built ships that could cross dangerous waters. They turned shells into royal purple. They became intermediaries between empires. And in time, one of their western colonies, Carthage, would grow into a power mighty enough to challenge Rome itself. But tonight, we do not rush toward war. We do not begin with Rome, or with Hannibal, or with the burning of Carthage. We begin quietly, on the shore. Imagine the coast at dusk. The mountains stand dark behind the city, their slopes touched by the last amber light. The harbor is crowded with wooden ships, their hulls smelling of salt, resin, pitch, and cedar. Sailors speak in low voices as ropes are coiled and cargo is checked. Amphorae stand in rows, bales of cloth wait beneath awnings, copper ingots from Cyprus, silver from the west, timber from inland forests, glass vessels, carved ivory, wine, oil, incense, and dyed textiles move slowly through the hands of merchants and scribes. Beyond the harbor wall, the sea rises and falls in a steady rhythm. This is not the sea as a barrier. For the Phoenicians, it is a road of blue darkness, a road of risk, a road of profit, a road of memory. And along that road, in the long centuries before classical empires wrote the loudest versions of history, the Phoenicians built a world that was not always recorded in grand inscriptions, but can still be traced in harbors, shipwrecks, names, letters, ruins, and echoes. So settle deeper now. Let your breathing slow. Let the coast of the ancient Levant appear in the mind like a quiet painting. And let us begin with the land itself, because every civilization begins, in some way, with the shape of the place that holds it. The Phoenician homeland was small. This is one of the first things to understand. When we think of great ancient civilizations, we often imagine vast river valleys, immense capitals, huge agricultural plains, and powerful kings claiming authority over distant provinces. Egypt had the Nile, a long green ribbon running through desert. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates, with their cities, canals, fields, and old struggles between flood and drought. Later Persia would command an empire from the Aegean to the Indus. Rome would hold lands around nearly the entire Mediterranean. Phoenicia was different. It occupied a narrow coastal strip along the eastern Mediterranean. The mountains stood close to the sea. In many places, there was little room for broad agriculture. The coast was broken by headlands, small bays, offshore islands, and natural harbors. The landscape encouraged local independence. One city could grow powerful, but geography did not naturally create one large, unified inland state. This helps explain why Phoenician history is often a history of city-states, rather than a single kingdom. Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Arwad, and other cities each had their own rulers, temples, elites, trading networks, and political fortunes. Sometimes one city became more influential than the others. Sometimes they competed. Sometimes they cooperated. Sometimes they paid tribute to larger empires. But they did not become one centralized Phoenician empire in the way that later historians might expect. Their power was flexible, their wealth was mobile. Their strength lay not in deep territory, but in connection. The mountains, though limiting in one sense, were also a blessing. The cedar forests of Lebanon were famous throughout the ancient Near East. Cedar wood was strong, fragrant, durable, and valuable. Egyptian pharaohs desired it for temples, ships, and coffins. Mesopotamian rulers sought it for palaces and monuments. In the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, the cedar forest appears as a place of wonder and danger, showing how deeply these forests lived in the imagination of the ancient world. For coastal cities, cedar meant ships. Ships meant travel. Travel meant trade. Trade meant wealth. Wealth meant influence. The Phoenicians did not invent seafaring in the Mediterranean, but they became among its most skillful and persistent practitioners. They learnt the moods of the sea and the seasonal winds. They knew the importance of coastal sailing, island routes, safe anchorages, and long-distance exchange. Their world was not limited to what a person could walk across. It extended wherever a ship could go, and yet the sea was never simple. Ancient sailing was dangerous. Storms could scatter fleets, reefs could destroy hulls, pirates could threaten cargo, political conflict could close harbors. Navigation required experience, memory, and courage. A sailor moving west from the Levant had to understand not only the water, but the people along the shore. Who traded fairly, who demanded tribute, who offered shelter, who might attack, and which gods should be honored before leaving port. A Phoenician harbor at dawn would have been a world of careful preparation. Men checking the hull, merchants inspecting seals, scribes marking goods, priests offering prayers, families watching the ships depart, the sea glittering beyond the breakwater, and above the city perhaps, the scent of cedar smoke and incense rising from temple courtyards. This was a civilization shaped by pressure. Pressure from geography, pressure from neighboring powers, pressure from demand, pressure from opportunity, and from that pressure came movement. The Phoenicians became masters of movement. The Phoenicians did not appear suddenly from nowhere. They emerged from the older Canaanite world of the Levant. The people later called Phoenicians spoke a northwest Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, Aramaic, and other languages of the region. Their religious traditions, city life, artistic forms, and social structures grew from the broader Bronze Age culture of Canaan. In many ways, Phoenician civilization was a continuation and transformation of coastal Canaanite life after the great disruptions at the end of the Bronze Age. This point matters because ancient identities were not always the same as the labels used by outsiders. The word Phoenician is largely a Greek label. The people of Tyre or Sidon may have identified first with their city, their family, their god, their ruler, their trade, or their local community. They belonged to a cultural linguistic world that modern scholars call Phoenician. But their own sense of identity was probably more layered and more local. Long before the first millennium BC, the eastern Mediterranean was already connected. Egyptian ships sailed north. Canaanite cities traded with Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Minoan and Mycenaean traders moved through the Aegean. Ugarit, farther north on the Syrian coast, became a major late Bronze Age city whose archives preserve texts in several languages, including an alphabetic cuneiform script. Diplomatic marriages, luxury gifts, copper, tin, timber, wine, oil, textiles, and precious objects moved between courts. The late Bronze Age was a world of palaces and letters. Kings wrote to kings, envoys crossed dangerous roads, merchants traveled under protection, temples stored goods, scribes recorded exchanges. But around the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century BC, much of this system fractured. The causes were complex and are still debated. Climate stress, internal unrest, earthquakes, changing warfare, movement of peoples, disruption of trade networks. and the collapse of palace economies all likely played roles in different regions. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean palace centers in Greece were destroyed or abandoned. Ugarit was destroyed. Egypt survived but weakened. The Eastern Mediterranean entered a new and uncertain age. For the coastal cities of the Levant, this collapse was not simply an end. It was also an opening. As older imperial structures weakened, cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos adapted. They inherited skills from the Bronze Age world: shipbuilding, trade, writing, craftsmanship, diplomacy, and religious traditions. But they now operated in a changed Mediterranean, where flexible maritime networks could become more important than palace-controlled routes. Out of the debris of the Bronze Age, Phoenician cities rose into greater prominence. They did not rise through conquest alone. They rose by knowing how to connect broken pieces. In the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, Phoenician merchants reached outward with increasing energy. Their ships moved along coasts and between islands. Their goods appeared far from home. Their alphabet spread. Their colonies began to take shape. The world had changed, and the Phoenicians were ready for a world of scattered harbors, uncertain powers, and long-distance opportunity. It is tempting to imagine them as mysterious because they left fewer surviving literary texts than Greeks or Romans. Much of what we know comes through archaeology, inscriptions, and accounts written by outsiders. Greek and Roman writers admired them, distrusted them, traded with them, borrowed from them, and sometimes turned them into stereotypes. But behind those later voices were real cities, real families, real sailors, real artisans, and real choices. A child born in Tyre might have heard several languages in the market. A merchant from Sidon might know the coast of Cyprus better than an inland valley only a few days away. A craftsman in Byblos might carve ivory for a foreign palace. A priest might serve a god whose name would be carried westward to new colonies. A sailor might leave home in spring and return months later with silver, tin, or stories of lands beyond the familiar horizon. The Phoenician world was both local and expansive. Rooted in old Canaan, drawn outward by the sea. Let us begin with Byblos. Byblos is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, with roots reaching far back into prehistory. By the Bronze Age, it had become an important coastal center, especially known for its relationship with Egypt and its role in the timber trade. The Greeks called it Byblos. Its earlier Semitic name was Gubla or Gibal. The Greek word Byblos became associated with papyrus, because papyrus from Egypt was traded through the city. From Byblos came biblion, meaning book, and eventually words like Bible. The path of words is never simple, but the association reminds us of the city's long connection with writing, trade, and exchange. Imagine Byblos in the 2nd millennium BC, a harbor full of ships, cedar logs waiting for transport, Egyptian-style objects in elite tombs, local rulers maintaining diplomatic ties with powerful neighbors, temples rising above the town, scribes recording goods and names. Byblos had an especially long relationship with Egypt. Egyptian pharaohs needed timber, and Lebanon's cedar forests provided it. Egyptian influence can be seen in artifacts, inscriptions, and religious connections, yet Byblos was not simply Egyptian. It was a Levantine city with its own rulers, its own traditions, and its own role as an intermediary. Trade was not only economic, it was cultural. Objects carried styles, names carried prestige, gods crossed boundaries, artisans adapted foreign forms, elites displayed imported goods to show status. In Byblos, we see the deep roots of the Phoenician talent for mediation. The city stood between worlds, translating materials, symbols, and desires from one cultural language into another. This is one of the quiet themes of Phoenician history. They were not only traders of objects, they were traders of meaning. A cedar beam could become part of an Egyptian temple. A carved ivory plaque could decorate an Assyrian palace. A Phoenician letter form could become part of the Greek alphabet. A Levantine deity could find a new home in a Western colony. A purple-dyed cloth could signal royal power, far from the workshop where it was made. Byblos reminds us that the Phoenicians inherited an old habit of connection, and connection, in history, can be more powerful than conquest. South of Byblos lay Sidon, another ancient and important Phoenician city. Sidon's name appears in many ancient sources, and at times it was so prominent that outsiders used the term Sidonian broadly for Phoenicians in general. In Greek epic, skilled Sidonian craftsmen are associated with luxury goods and fine workmanship. The city became famous for trade, artistry, and maritime activity. Sidon's location gave it access to the sea, coastal routes, and inland connections. Like other Phoenician cities, it rose and declined in relation to broader political pressures. It came under the influence of larger powers at different times, including Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, and later Hellenistic kingdoms. But in the imagination of the ancient Mediterranean, Sidon was a name of refinement. Think of workshops in the city, glassmakers experimenting with heat and minerals, metal workers shaping bowls, fittings, and ornaments, ivory carvers creating delicate scenes of animals, sphinxes, and floral patterns, dyers handling the costly and difficult process of purple production, weavers turning thread into cloth for elites and temples. Phoenician art often blended influences. Egyptian motifs might appear beside Mesopotamian forms. Local Levantine traditions might merge with styles desired by foreign buyers. This blending was not weakness. It was a commercial and artistic intelligence. Phoenician artisans understood markets. They knew what foreign elites wanted, and they could produce objects that felt both exotic and familiar. Sidon also became associated with glass. Ancient glassmaking had a long history in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the development of glass technologies was not the work of one place alone. But Phoenician cities, including Sidon, played an important role in the production and trade of glass objects. Later traditions even linked the discovery of glass to Phoenician merchants on a sandy shore. Though this story is legendary rather than literal history, what matters is the reputation. Sidon was remembered as a city of skill, and skill can travel farther than armies. A small object made in a Phoenician workshop might pass through many hands, cross hundreds of miles, and end up in a tomb, palace, shrine, or treasure room. Centuries later, archaeologists might find it and trace, through its style and material, the quiet reach of a coastal city. The Phoenicians often speak to us through objects: a bowl, a seal, a bead, a cargo jar, a carved panel, a fragment of dyed textile long since faded, an inscription on stone, a shipwreck resting under sand and water. Their history is sometimes not a continuous narrative, but a scattering of clues. And so we move slowly, as if walking through a dim museum at night, letting each object whisper a part of the story. If one city most fully captures the drama of Phoenician history, it is Tyre. Tyre was extraordinary. Part of the city stood on the mainland, but its most famous core lay on an island just off the coast. This gave it natural defensive advantages and a distinctive maritime character. Surrounded by water, protected by walls, and connected to wide trade networks, Tyre became one of the richest and most influential Phoenician cities. Ancient sources often describe Tyre with awe, envy, or condemnation, depending on the writer. It was a city of merchants, ships, purple dye, temples, and wealth. It became powerful enough to found colonies far to the west, including the settlement that would become Carthage. The island city must have been a striking sight. Walls rising from the sea, harbors crowded with ships, temples catching the morning light, warehouses filled with imported goods, workshops staining the air with the smell of dye. Merchants speaking of Cyprus, Egypt, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Tyre's wealth rested partly on trade, partly on industry, and partly on its ability to survive between larger powers. One of its most famous products was Tyrian purple. This dye was made from the secretions of certain sea snails, especially species of murex. The process was labor-intensive, smelly, and expensive. Large numbers of shells were needed to produce small amounts of dye, but the resulting color could be rich, durable, and associated with high status. Over time, purple became connected with royalty, priesthood, and imperial authority in many cultures. A purple garment was not just clothing, it was a declaration. It said wealth, it said rank, it said access to distant networks and specialized craft. Imagine the dye workshops near the shore, piles of shells. Workers breaking, extracting, soaking, boiling, timing, watching color transform through strange stages under sunlight and air. The smell would have been strong, perhaps overwhelming, but from that harsh process came one of the most desired luxury colors of the ancient world. Tyre turned the sea itself into prestige. The same waters that carried ships also provided the shells that dyed the cloth that marked kings. The Phoenicians had a gift for extracting value from what others might overlook. Cedar from mountains, shellfish from rocks, harbors from broken coastlines, letters from sounds, colonies from distant trading posts, influence from movement. Tyre also became famous for its god Melkart, whose name can be understood as something like King of the City, was the great patron deity of Tyre. He was associated with kingship, protection, fertility, and later, through Greek interpretation, identified with Heracles. As Phoenician traders and settlers moved west, the worship of Melkart traveled with them. Temples to Melkart could become markers of Tyrian identity abroad, linking distant communities back to the island city. In the ancient Mediterranean, religion traveled with merchants. A trading station was not only a warehouse, it needed shrines, rituals, oaths, festivals, and divine protection. The sea was dangerous, and sailors did not trust wood and rope alone. They trusted gods. Tyre's importance grew especially during the early 1st millennium BC. It engaged with Israel and Judah, traded with many regions, and became central in later traditions. The biblical accounts of King Hiram of Tyre describe cooperation with Solomon in supplying cedar and craftsmen for building projects. These accounts reflect the broader historical reality that Phoenician timber and expertise were highly valued by neighboring kingdoms. Whether in scripture, archaeology, or classical writing, Tyre appears as a city whose influence far exceeded its physical size. But wealth attracts attention, and Tyre, like all Phoenician cities, had to navigate the ambitions of empires. The Phoenician cities were rarely isolated. They lived in the shadow of greater land powers. To the south, Egypt had long interests in the Levant. To the east and northeast, Mesopotamian empires rose and expanded: Assyria, Babylonia, and later Persia. To the west lay the open sea, with its islands, markets, and unknowns. The Phoenicians became skilled in survival through diplomacy, tribute, trade, and adaptation. When a great empire demanded submission, a Phoenician city might pay tribute rather than be destroyed. It might provide ships, sailors, timber, luxury goods, or taxes. Under Assyrian rule, Phoenician cities were valuable because of their maritime networks and wealth. Assyrian kings boasted of receiving tribute from coastal rulers, and reliefs and inscriptions show the imperial logic of domination. Yet domination was not always total. Empires often wanted revenue and loyalty, more than direct control over every harbour detail. Phoenician cities could retain local rulers and continue trading, as long as they acknowledged imperial power. This created a delicate balance. Too much independence could bring punishment. Too much submission could weaken local prestige. Too much wealth could provoke suspicion. Too little cooperation could close trade routes. The Phoenicians learnt to bend, and bending, in history, is sometimes how cultures endure. Assyria, at its height, was a formidable power. Its armies were feared. Its kings projected terror as policy. Cities that rebelled could face siege, deportation, destruction, and humiliation. Phoenician cities sometimes resisted, sometimes submitted, and sometimes shifted alliances. Sidon suffered severely under Assyrian punishment in the 7th century BC, while Tyre's island position made it more difficult to capture completely. Later, Babylonian power replaced Assyrian power in parts of the Near East. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, campaigned in the region and laid a long siege to Tyre according to ancient traditions. The exact details of that siege remain debated, but the broader point is clear. Tyre was important enough to draw the sustained attention of a major empire. Then came Persia. Under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Phoenician cities became part of a vast imperial system. They were especially valuable for naval power. Phoenician ships and crews served in Persian fleets, including during campaigns against the Greeks. In this period, cities such as Sidon and Tyre retained significance under Persian rule, though tensions and revolts occurred. The Phoenicians were not simply victims of empire. They were also participants in empire. Their ships could serve imperial strategy. Their artisans could serve imperial courts. Their merchants could profit from imperial roads and stability. Their elites could negotiate status within larger political structures. This was not always comfortable, but it was realistic. A small coastal city could not pretend that Assyria or Persia did not exist. It had to survive them, and while empires rose and fell inland, Phoenician ships continued to move. The sea gave them options. A land empire could demand tribute from a city, but a merchant family might have relatives in Cyprus, partners in Egypt, contacts in Sicily, and a cousin in a western colony. Networks could outlive kings. This is one reason the Phoenician story is so difficult and so fascinating. It is not a simple line of rulers and battles. It is a web of harbours, a web of families, a web of contracts, a web of gods, a web of letters, a web stretched across the Mediterranean, shimmering like moonlight on water. Perhaps the most lasting Phoenician contribution to world history was not a palace, a battle, or a monument. It was a script. The Phoenician alphabet was part of a broader development of alphabetic writing in the ancient Near East. Earlier alphabetic systems had already appeared, including Proto-Sinaitic and related early West Semitic scripts. The Phoenicians did not create writing from nothing, but the standardized Phoenician script of the early 1st millennium BC became extremely influential because Phoenician traders carried it widely, and because it was practical, adaptable, and relatively simple compared with many older writing systems. Unlike cuneiform, which used many signs and required long scribal training, or Egyptian hieroglyphic systems with complex combinations of signs, the Phoenician alphabet used a small set of consonantal signs. It represented consonants, while readers supplied the vowels from knowledge of the language. This type of script is often called an abjad. Its power lay in economy. A limited number of signs could record names, dedications, ownership, trade information, and inscriptions. It was not necessarily a democratic revolution in the modern sense, because literacy was still limited, but it lowered some barriers and proved remarkably portable. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet, adding signs for vowels and reshaping letter forms. From Greek came the Etruscan and Latin alphabets, among others. Through these long chains of adaptation, the Phoenician script became one of the ancestors of writing systems used across much of the world today. When you read letters on a page now, you are very far from ancient Tyre or Byblos. And yet, through deep history, a connection remains. The alphabet is one of those quiet inventions that changes civilization not by thunder, but by repetition. A mark, a sound, a name, a list, a contract, a dedication, a memory, again and again. Imagine a Phoenician scribe near a harbour. He takes a piece of pottery, a wax tablet, papyrus, parchment, or another writing surface. He marks goods, names, quantities, ownership, origin, destination. He does not think he is altering world history. He is solving a practical problem. This shipment belongs to this merchant. This jar contains this product. This offering is dedicated to this god. This name must be remembered. History often changes through practical solutions. The Phoenician alphabet spread because it worked. It was light enough to travel, simple enough to adapt, useful enough to survive. The Greeks did not merely copy it, they transformed it. But they knew, and later writers acknowledged, that they had received letters from the Phoenicians. In Greek tradition, the figure of Cadmus, a Phoenician prince, was said to have brought letters to Greece. The myth is not a literal historical report, but it preserves a memory of cultural transmission from the Levant to the Aegean. Cadmus walks through legend carrying signs, and behind the legend stands a real process. Contact, borrowing, adaptation. A trader shows a mark, a local imitates it. A sound shifts, a letter changes shape, a script becomes another script, a commercial habit becomes a literary civilization. Without Phoenician letters, Greek writing would have developed differently. Without Greek writing, the preservation of classical literature would have been different. Without Latin letters, much of the later written world would look different. The Phoenicians did not write the Iliad. They did not write Roman law. They did not print Renaissance books. But the road of letters passes, in part through their hands, and that is enough to make them one of the hidden architects of written history. The Phoenicians were famous sailors, but to say this too quickly is to miss the depth of what it means. Ancient seafaring required more than courage. It required shipbuilding, astronomy, weather knowledge, coastal geography, diplomacy, commercial trust, storage systems, and generations of accumulated experience. A successful maritime culture is not made only in the harbour. It is made in forests, workshops, counting rooms, temples, families, and memories. Phoenician ships varied by period and purpose. Merchant vessels needed capacity and stability. Warships needed speed, maneuverability, and crews trained to row and fight. The famous biremes and later triremes of Mediterranean naval warfare were part of a long tradition of ship development, in which Phoenician expertise was highly valued. A merchant ship leaving Tyre might first sail to Cyprus. Cyprus was close enough to be a natural partner, and it was rich in copper. From there, routes could continue toward the Aegean, Anatolia, Egypt, or farther west. Ships often hugged coastlines when possible, but open water crossings were also made between islands and strategic points. The Mediterranean was not one uniform space. It was a chain of smaller seas, each with its own dangers. The Levantine coast, the waters around Cyprus, the Aegean Islands, the Ionian Sea, the coasts of Sicily, the Tyrrhenian waters near Italy, the straits around Sardinia and Corsica, the North African shore, the long route toward the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Every stretch had winds, currents, harbours, peoples, and risks. A Phoenician sailor did not carry a modern map. He carried knowledge. Knowledge of stars, knowledge of landmarks, knowledge of seasons, knowledge of where fresh water could be found, knowledge of which rulers controlled which ports, knowledge of prices, knowledge of rumours, knowledge of fear. The North Star, known to later Greeks in connection with Phoenician navigation, may have played a role in orientation. Ancient sailors used the sky, but not in the precise instrument-based way of modern navigation. They relied on experience and pattern recognition. Sailing was memory written in the body. The angle of wind on the cheek, the sound of waves against the hull, the smell of land before it appeared, the colour of water over shallows, the behaviour of birds, the shape of clouds over mountains. The Phoenician world was built on such knowledge, and because they travelled so widely, they became carriers of information. A merchant arriving in Tyre from the west might bring news of silver sources in Iberia, conflict in Sicily, opportunities in Sardinia, shifting alliances among Greek communities, or demand for certain goods in North Africa. News moved with cargo, political intelligence moved with trade, myths moved with sailors, techniques moved with craftsmen. The sea was not silent, it spoke through returning ships. What did the Phoenicians trade? The answer changed by place and period, but several categories appear again and again. Timber was crucial, especially cedar. Metals were important, copper from Cyprus, silver and other metals from the western Mediterranean, tin connected to bronze production, and iron in later periods. Luxury goods included ivory carvings, metal bowls, jewelry, glass, dyed textiles, perfumes, and decorated objects. Everyday trade also mattered. Wine, oil, pottery, fish products, grain, and other commodities moved through Phoenician networks. Trade was not always direct from producer to final buyer. Phoenicians often acted as intermediaries. They moved goods from one region to another, repackaged them, adapted them, exchanged them, and inserted them into broader systems of desire and status. A piece of raw material might travel through several hands before becoming an elite object. A luxury item might combine materials and styles from multiple cultures. This made Phoenician commerce difficult to define narrowly. Were they exporters, importers, manufacturers, middlemen, colonizers, sailors, diplomats, smugglers, artisans? At different times they could be all of these. Their genius lay in flexibility. Consider purple dye again. It required local access to marine resources, specialized knowledge, labor, and markets willing to pay high prices. It turned a coastal craft into international prestige. Consider cedar. It required mountain access, cutting, transport, negotiation, and shipping. It connected inland forests to foreign temples and palaces. Consider metals. Bronze Age and Iron Age economies depended on metal flows. Copper, tin, silver, and iron were not evenly distributed. Those who could move them held influence. Consider glass and ivory. These objects appealed to elites who wanted beauty, rarity, and symbolic power. Phoenician craftsmen could create works that traveled well and spoke the visual language of multiple courts. Trade also required trust. In a world without modern banks, insurance systems, or standardized international law, merchants depended on family networks, temple guarantees, reputation, repeated exchange, and sometimes royal protection. Colonies and trading stations helped reduce risk by creating familiar nodes in distant places. A merchant from Tyre, arriving in a western settlement, might find people who spoke his language, honored his gods, understood his weights, knew his family, and could store his goods. That familiarity mattered. It made the Mediterranean smaller. The Phoenicians did not conquer the sea by force alone. They made it familiar. Harbour by harbour, contract by contract, shrine by shrine, generation by generation. As Phoenician trade expanded, settlements appeared across the Mediterranean. Some were small trading posts. Some became more substantial colonies. Some began as seasonal or commercial stations and grew into towns. Their functions varied, safe harbour, access to metals, agricultural land, strategic control, exchange with local peoples, or support for longer voyages. Phoenician presence is attested in places such as Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, the Balearic Islands, and the Iberian Peninsula. The pattern was not identical everywhere. In some areas, Phoenicians settled beside or among local populations. In others, they established distinct enclaves. Trade, intermarriage, cultural exchange, competition, and conflict all played roles. This expansion was not like later European colonial empires. It was earlier, smaller in scale, and shaped by city-state networks rather than modern nation-states. But it was still a form of colonization, because Phoenician communities established lasting settlements far from their homeland, changed local economies, and connected distant regions to Eastern Mediterranean networks. One of the most important western regions was southern Iberia, especially because of metal resources. The Phoenician settlement at Gadir, later known as Gades and today associated with Cadiz in Spain, became one of the most famous and ancient Phoenician foundations in the far west. Its location near the Atlantic Gateway made it strategically and commercially important. The western horizon held promise: silver, tin roots, fish, salt, agricultural products, access to Atlantic knowledge. For a sailor from Tyre, the far west must have felt like the edge of the known world. The Pillars of Heracles, later associated with the Strait of Gibraltar, marked a psychological boundary. Beyond lay the Atlantic, more unpredictable than the enclosed Mediterranean. Yet Phoenician and later Carthaginian sailors ventured beyond, exploring and trading along Atlantic coasts. Ancient reports describe voyages that may reflect real expeditions, though details are sometimes difficult to separate from legend. The Carthaginian navigator Hanno is said to have sailed along the west coast of Africa, while Himilco was associated with northern Atlantic routes. These belong more properly to the Punic, or Western Phoenician, world centered on Carthage, but they grew from the older Phoenician maritime tradition. The point is not that every ancient tale is literal. The point is that Phoenician and Punic sailors were remembered as people who pushed the horizon outward. They made the far west thinkable, and of all the colonies they founded, one would become so powerful that its story nearly eclipsed its mother cities. Carthage. But before we enter Carthage, we should pause. We should feel the quiet scale of what has happened. From a narrow Levantine coast, a network now stretches westward across the sea. Cities that began with harbours under mountains now have daughters among foreign shores. The Phoenician world is no longer only Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos. It is a chain of lights along the Mediterranean darkness. A ship leaves Tyre. It stops in Cyprus. It trades in Sicily. It hears news in Sardinia. It reaches North Africa. It moves toward Iberia. And everywhere, in some form, there are familiar signs. Letters carved into stone, a god's name, a style of pottery, a merchant's seal, a purple cloth, a memory of home. The sea has become a Phoenician archive. Carthage began as a Phoenician colony on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia. Its traditional foundation date is 8114 BC, though archaeology and legend must be handled carefully. Ancient stories connect its founding to Queen Dido, also known as Alyssa, a Tyrian princess who fled political turmoil and established a new city. The most famous version comes through later classical literature, especially Virgil's Aeneid, where Dido becomes a tragic queen entangled in Rome's mythic destiny. But behind the legend lies a historical reality. Phoenician settlers from the Levant established a settlement in a superb location. Carthage had access to fertile hinterlands, good harbours, and central Mediterranean routes. It stood near the narrow passage between Sicily and North Africa, a strategic point for movement between East and West. Over time, as the old Phoenician cities in the Levant came under increasing pressure from Near Eastern empires, Carthage grew stronger and more independent. Carthage was not simply a copy of Tyre. It became something new, a Western Phoenician, or Punic, power. The word Punic comes from the Latin poeni, related to Phoenician. Roman writers used it to describe Carthaginians and their culture. Punic language developed from Phoenician and continued to be spoken for centuries in North Africa, even after Rome destroyed Carthage as a political power. At first, Carthage was one node in the Phoenician network. Later, it became the center of its own network. It founded or controlled settlements, influenced trade in the Western Mediterranean, and became deeply involved in Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Iberia. Its ships protected trade, Its armies, often including mercenaries and allied troops, fought for influence. Its elite families managed a complex republic-like political system with magistrates, councils, and powerful aristocratic interests. But that larger Carthaginian story belongs partly to a later chapter. For now, imagine the early city, a settlement rising beside blue water, temples and houses built by people who remembered Tyre, ships arriving from the east, local North African communities trading, negotiating, intermarrying, resisting, adapting, a new identity forming slowly under the sun. The mother city was far away, but the language remained, the gods remained, the habits of trade remained, the alphabet remained. Carthage was Phoenician memory planted in African soil, and one day, that memory would grow into Rome's greatest rival. Phoenician religion was rich, local, and deeply connected to older Canaanite traditions. It is difficult to describe as one uniform system, because each city had its own divine patrons and cultic traditions. Yet certain gods and themes appear across the Phoenician world. Baal, meaning lord or master, could refer to various local storm or fertility deities. Astarte was a powerful goddess, associated with sexuality, fertility, war, and royal protection in different contexts. Melkart was especially important in Tyre. Eshmun was associated with healing and strongly connected with Sidon. Tanit became highly important in Carthage, especially alongside Baal-Hamon, though this belongs more to the Punic West. Phoenician religion was not separate from politics or commerce. Temples held wealth. Kings derived legitimacy from gods. Merchants made vows before voyages. Colonists carried deities to new settlements. Offerings marked gratitude, fear, hope, and obligation. A sailor leaving harbour might pray for safe passage. A merchant might dedicate a portion of profit. A family might offer thanks for healing. A city might honour its patron during festivals that reinforced civic identity. The gods were not abstract ideas, they were woven into daily life. Phoenician religious symbols and names travelled widely. In colonies, temples helped maintain links to the homeland. A sanctuary to Melkart in a distant settlement could act as both religious centre and cultural anchor. It reminded settlers who they were, where they came from, and which divine power protected their enterprise. Ancient religion was also highly interactive across cultures. Greeks identified Melkart with Heracles. Astarte could be associated with Aphrodite or other goddesses. Egyptian motifs influenced Phoenician religious art. Local Western deities could merge with imported Phoenician forms. This was not simply confusion. It was translation. Just as merchants translated goods into value, religious communities translated gods into recognizable forms. But Phoenician, and especially Carthaginian religion, also became controversial in ancient and modern discussion because of evidence and accusations concerning child sacrifice. This subject must be handled carefully. Classical Greek and Roman authors accused Carthaginians and sometimes Phoenicians of sacrificing children. Archaeological discoveries of Tophets, especially in Carthage and other Punic sites, contain urns with cremated remains of infants and animals, along with inscriptions dedicated to deities such as Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Scholars have debated whether these remains represent sacrificed children, special burials for infants who died naturally, or a complex combination of ritual practices. Many specialists today accept that child sacrifice occurred in at least some Punic contexts, though the scale, meaning, and interpretation remain debated. What is important is not to repeat ancient propaganda uncritically, but also not to dismiss archaeological evidence too easily. For a sleep history narrative, we do not linger on horror, but accuracy requires acknowledging the debate. Ancient religion could be beautiful, communal, terrifying, tender, and severe. It could produce music, festivals, healing rites, vows, and offerings. It could also demand what modern minds find unbearable. The Phoenician religious world, like all ancient religious worlds, was not simple. It lived in incense and fire, in carved stone and whispered prayer, in ships blessed before departure, in names given to children, in temples built beside harbours, in offerings buried beneath the earth, in gods carried across the sea. Let us step away from kings and empires for a while. Let us enter an ordinary day. Morning comes slowly over a Phoenician city. The first light touches the sea, then the upper walls, then the flat roofs of houses. Roosters call. Smoke rises from small hearths. Potters open their workshops. Fishermen return or prepare to leave. A woman grinds grain. A child carries water. A merchant's assistant unlocks a storage room. A priest climbs temple steps. Sailors move toward the harbor before the heat of the day. The city is compact, dense, and alive. Houses may be built of stone, mud brick, timber, and plaster, depending on place and wealth. Streets are narrow. Courtyards provide light and workspace. Roofs can serve as sleeping areas in warm weather. Storage jars line rooms. Loom weights, grinding stones, lamps, figurines, and pottery fill the domestic world. The smell of the city is layered. Bread baking, fish drying, olive oil, smoke, animals, seaweed, resin, sweat, incense, dye vats, wet rope, cedar wood. Ancient cities were sensory places. They were not clean in the modern sense. They were crowded, noisy, fragrant, foul, bright, shadowed, and intimate. Work began early. Craftsmen shaped goods for local use and export. Women and men both contributed to household economies, textile work, food preparation, religious obligations, family management, and sometimes trade. Slaves and dependent laborers likely played roles, as in many ancient societies, though the evidence varies by period and place. Children grew up hearing many kinds of speech, Phoenician in the home and market, perhaps Egyptian, Aramaic, Greek, or other languages in trade contexts. Names of distant places spoken as ordinary facts. Cyprus, Memphis, Nineveh, Sicily, Gadir, Carthage. In such a city, the world was both small and enormous. A person might live their entire life within a few streets. Yet the objects around them came from across the sea. A bowl with foreign style, a bead from distant material, a story told by a sailor, a god with a name known in another harbour, a letter from a relative abroad. Phoenician life was deeply urban, but it was also maritime. The harbour shaped the calendar. Sailing seasons mattered. Storms mattered. Political changes abroad mattered. Storms mattered. Political changes abroad mattered. The success of a voyage could affect many families. A ship's departure was not just business, it was emotion. Men leaving, families waiting, goods invested, prayers offered, risks accepted. Months later, a sail might appear on the horizon. People would gather. Is it ours? Did they return? What news do they bring? What cargo? Who is missing? The sea gave wealth, but it also took. A Phoenician city lived with that bargain every day. The surviving evidence for Phoenician social life is uneven, and we must be careful not to invent certainty where the sources are quiet. Still, we can say that Phoenician society, like many ancient urban societies, was organized through households, kinship, status, property, religious obligations, and civic identity. Elite families played major roles in politics and trade. Merchant households could be powerful because commerce depended on trust across generations. Marriage alliances may have helped connect families within and between cities. Women appear in inscriptions, names, religious contexts, and legendary traditions. Elite women could hold status, make dedications, and participate in the religious and social life of the community. The legendary Dido of Carthage, though shaped by later myth, reflects the possibility that women could be imagined as founders, rulers, and figures of dynastic importance. But ordinary women's lives are harder to see. They worked. They raised children. They managed households. They participated in textile production and food preparation. They worshipped, mourned, negotiated, and endured. Some may have been involved in trade or property, depending on local custom and family status. In the quiet spaces of history, ordinary lives often disappear first. A mother waiting for a son's ship, a daughter learning to weave, a widow making a dedication in a sanctuary, a slave grinding grain before dawn, a merchant's wife managing accounts while he is abroad, a child tracing letters in dust. These people rarely receive long inscriptions, but they were the civilization. History is not only the king whose name survives, it is also the hands that loaded the ship, the voices that sang in the house, the fingers that tied knots, the eyes that watched the sea. The Phoenician language belonged to the northwest Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. It was closely related to Hebrew and other Canaanite languages. Written Phoenician appears in inscriptions from the Levant and across the Mediterranean, wherever Phoenician and Punic communities settled. Over time, regional forms developed, especially in the Western Mediterranean, where Punic continued as a living language for many centuries. Phoenician was written with the Phoenician alphabet, usually from right to left. The script recorded consonants, not vowels in the full way that later Greek did. For readers fluent in the language, this was usually enough. The language carried names that still echo faintly. Hannibal, from Punic, means something like Baal has been gracious, or grace of Baal. Hasdrubal can be understood in relation to help or assistance of Baal. Melkart contains the idea of the king of the city. Many names were theophoric, meaning they contained the name of a god. Names were small prayers. Every time a name was spoken, a god might be remembered. Phoenician inscriptions are often brief. Dedications, funerary texts, ownership marks, royal inscriptions, or commemorations. We do not possess a large surviving Phoenician literature comparable to Greek drama, Hebrew scripture, or Mesopotamian epic. This absence shapes how modern people imagine the Phoenicians. They seem silent, but they were not silent. Their writings simply did not survive in the same way. Papyrus, parchment, and other perishable materials decay. Wars destroy archives. Later cultures copy some texts and neglect others. Climate matters. Chance matters. Preservation is not the same as importance. The Phoenicians almost certainly had stories, songs, records, myths, contracts, letters, and technical knowledge written or transmitted orally. Much is lost. What remains is enough to prove their presence, but not enough to give us their full voice, so we listen carefully to fragments. An inscription on a sarcophagus, a dedication to a god, a name scratched on pottery, a letter form borrowed by another people, a Punic phrase surviving in a Roman comedy. Fragments can still speak, if we do not demand that they shout. Phoenician art is often described as eclectic. That word can sound dismissive, as if the art lacked identity of its own. But in the Phoenician case, eclecticism was part of the identity. Their art moved between worlds because their society moved between worlds. A Phoenician ivory carving might show Egyptian-style figures, Near Eastern animals, lotus flowers, sphinxes, winged creatures, or hybrid motifs. Metal bowls might combine local skill with foreign imagery. Seals, jewelry, and small luxury goods often reveal a cosmopolitan visual language. Phoenician artisans were not isolated creators working for one court only. They made goods for many markets. They adapted, they translated, they selected, they blended. This was not random borrowing, it was intelligent design for a connected world. A foreign king might want an object that looked prestigious, exotic, familiar, and sacred all at once. Phoenician craftsmen could provide that. Their objects traveled into Assyrian palaces, Greek sanctuaries, Iberian tombs, and beyond. Art became diplomacy in material form. A carved ivory panel might say, "I belong to the world of kings. I know the language of Egypt. I know the patterns of the Levant. I have passed through skilled hands. I am luxury made portable." Small objects can carry large meanings. In Phoenician art, we see not the absence of identity, but the identity of exchange. They were masters of the in-between, between Egypt and Mesopotamia, between the Levant and the Aegean, between East and West, between local gods and foreign symbols, between raw material and royal desire. Their art belongs to the harbour, not because it is crude or temporary, but because it is always ready to travel. One of the most frustrating things about the Phoenicians is that they did not leave us a complete history written in their own voice. Or if they did, it has not survived. This means that much of what we know about them comes from others. Assyrian inscriptions, Egyptian references, Hebrew biblical texts, Greek historians and poets, Roman writers, and archaeology. Each source has its own perspective and bias. Assyrian kings described Phoenician rulers as tribute bearers. Biblical texts often viewed Phoenician cities through theological and political concerns. Greek writers admired Phoenician skill, but sometimes portrayed them as cunning or deceptive traders. Roman writers inherited hostility toward Carthage and could project that hostility backward onto Phoenician identity. Outsiders rarely describe a people neutrally. They describe what matters to them. To an empire, Phoenicians are tribute. To a rival, they are dangerous merchants. To a borrower of letters, they are culture bringers. To a moralizing writer, they are luxury and temptation. To a victorious enemy, they are defeated arrogance. Modern history has to move carefully through these mirrors. Archaeology helps. It gives us harbours, pottery, tombs, inscriptions, workshops, ship remains, settlement patterns, and material culture. But archaeology also has limits. It can show what people made, ate, traded, buried, and built. It cannot always tell us what they felt, feared, remembered, or intended. So the Phoenicians remain partly mysterious, not because they were more mystical than other ancient peoples, but because history preserved them unevenly. Their greatest achievement may have been connection, and connection leaves traces everywhere, but rarely in one single book. To understand them, we gather the traces: a cedar beam in an Egyptian context, a Phoenician inscription in Cyprus, a purple dye installation near the coast, a sanctuary in the west, a Greek letter shaped by Phoenician signs, a Roman fear of Carthage, a biblical memory of Tyrian wealth, an Assyrian boast about tribute. Piece by piece, the silent map appears, and the more we look, the more we realize that the Phoenicians were not a minor people on the edge of history. They were one of the peoples who made the Mediterranean into a connected world. Let us pause here for a moment. The room around you is quiet. The ancient harbor is quiet too. The ships are moored, the ropes are still. The last light has faded behind the mountains. Only a few lamps burn near the water. Somewhere, a scribe finishes a line of letters. Somewhere, a priest closes a temple gate. Somewhere, a sailor dreams of Cyprus. Somewhere, a child hears the word Carthage for the first time and imagines it as a place beyond the edge of the world. The Phoenician story is not finished. We have only begun. Ahead lie the full expansion of their colonies, the growth of Carthage, the western metal routes, the rise of Greek competition, Persian service, Alexander's siege of Tyre, Punic resilience, Roman rivalry, and the long afterlife of Phoenician letters, religion, and memory. But for now, let the first part settle. A narrow land, a cedar mountain, a purple shore, a city on an island, a script of simple signs, a sea filled with roads, and from that sea, the quiet sound of oars fading into the dark. To understand Phoenician expansion, we should not imagine a sudden leap from Lebanon to Spain. The sea was crossed step by step, island by island, harbor by harbor, generation by generation, and one of the first great doorways was Cyprus. Cyprus lies not far from the Levantine coast. On a clear day, in the imagination of a sailor, it might feel almost like the first stone in a path laid across the water. The island had rich copper resources, and copper was one of the essential materials of the ancient world. For much of the Bronze Age, copper was combined with tin to make bronze, the metal of weapons, tools, vessels, and prestige objects. Even after iron became increasingly important, copper remained valuable. For Phoenician merchants, Cyprus offered both resources and position. It stood between the Levant, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Aegean. It was close enough for regular contact, and far enough to be a true maritime station. It was not empty, of course. Cyprus had its own complex societies, traditions, languages, and political communities. Phoenician presence on Cyprus developed through trade, settlement, religious exchange, and political relationships. The island became a meeting ground. Here, Eastern Mediterranean worlds overlapped. Phoenician traders met local Cypriots. Greek-speaking communities became increasingly important. Assyrian and later Persian imperial interests reached across the island. Temples, inscriptions, pottery, and art reveal a landscape where cultures did not simply replace one another, but lived side by side, competed, borrowed, and blended. Imagine a Phoenician ship arriving at a Cypriot harbor. The sea is bright in the morning. The cargo is checked. Copper ingots are discussed. Local officials or merchants approach. A translator may be needed, or perhaps the traders already share enough words through long habit. A shrine receives a small offering. The sailors rest, repair, bargain, listen, and prepare for the next crossing. Cyprus taught the Phoenicians how distance could be managed. A short voyage becomes a route becomes a habit becomes a network becomes history. And from Cyprus, the horizon widened. The central Mediterranean was not a blank space waiting to be discovered. It was a crowded, ancient, layered world. Before the Phoenicians arrived, islands such as Sicily, Malta, Sardinia, and others had their own communities, ritual landscapes, trade habits, and local powers. The Phoenicians entered these worlds as outsiders, but not always as conquerors. Often they came first as traders, establishing seasonal stations, harbor communities, storage points, and small settlements that allowed ships to move safely across longer routes. The central Mediterranean mattered because it connected east and west. A ship moving from Tyre or Sidon toward Spain could not simply sail endlessly into the unknown. It needed places to stop. It needed water, food, repairs, local knowledge, protection, and trusted contacts. Islands became stepping stones. Malta and nearby islands offered strategic positions between Sicily and North Africa. Pantelleria, lying between Sicily and Tunisia, mattered because of its location. Sicily was rich, large, fertile, and placed at the heart of central Mediterranean traffic. Sardinia offered resources, harbours, and access to western routes. Phoenician settlement in Sicily concentrated especially in the western part of the island, in places such as Motia, Panormus, and Saguntum. The island was also a major zone of Greek colonization. Over time, Greek and Phoenician communities became neighbours, rivals, trading partners, and sometimes enemies. Sicily would later become one of the great battlegrounds between Carthaginian and Greek ambitions, but in the beginning, before the Great Wars, there was contact. Think of a Sicilian shore in the 8th or 7th century BC. A Phoenician vessel glides into a sheltered bay. Local people watch from the land. There may be suspicion, but also curiosity. The strangers bring metal objects, beads, cloth, wine, oil, or luxury goods. They want grain, hides, access, perhaps permission to store goods or build. A few words become familiar. A few marriages may occur. A few graves begin to hold foreign objects. Trade changes a place slowly, not always by force, sometimes by desire. A local leader wants imported prestige goods. A Phoenician merchant wants local resources. A craftsman copies a foreign pattern. A child grows up hearing two languages. A god is interpreted under another name. A harbour becomes permanent. In Sardinia, Phoenician settlements also became important. The island had a rich indigenous Nuragic culture, known for its distinctive stone towers called nuraghi, and it was not a passive landscape. Phoenician settlers interacted with local communities in complex ways, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through competition and control. Later, Carthage would extend stronger influence over Sardinia, making it a major part of the Punic Western world. The Central Sea was therefore not just a route, it was a classroom. Here, Phoenician settlers learnt how to live among foreign populations far from home. Here, the habits of colonization became more durable. Here, the eastern cities began to create a western mirror of themselves. And in that mirror, the image slowly changed. The Phoenician became Punic, the trading post became city, the colony became power. Far to the west, beyond the central islands, beyond the familiar coasts of Sicily and Sardinia, beyond the long North African shore, lay the region that drew Phoenician ships with extraordinary force, southern Iberia. The far west promised metals, silver above all, but also other resources connected to the wealth of the ancient world. In the region associated with Tartessos, in southern Spain, Phoenician traders encountered societies rich enough to support intense exchange. The Guadalquivir Valley and surrounding mineral zones became part of a wide network that linked Iberian resources to eastern Mediterranean demand. At the edge of this world stood Gadir, known later to the Romans as Gades, and today associated with Cadiz. Gadir became one of the most famous Phoenician foundations in the far west. Ancient tradition gave it a very early foundation date, but archaeology suggests that secure evidence for Phoenician presence in the western Mediterranean belongs especially to the early 1st millennium BC. As always, legend preserves memory, but archaeology gives us firmer ground. The name Gadir means something like wall, enclosure, or fortress. The city stood near the Atlantic Gateway, close to the strait later called the Pillars of Heracles. For Phoenicians, and later for Greeks and Romans, this region marked the threshold between the Mediterranean and the ocean beyond. Imagine arriving there after weeks or months of travel. The sea feels different. The tides are stronger. The Atlantic breathes beyond the strait. The familiar Mediterranean world narrows behind you. Ahead lies a vastness that seems almost mythic. A sailor from Tyre might stand on the western shore and feel that he had reached the edge of the earth. But for merchants, edges are often beginnings. Gadir linked Mediterranean commerce with Atlantic possibilities. It gave Phoenicians access not only to Iberian metals, but also to routes, rumours, and resources beyond the enclosed sea. Later traditions speak of voyages farther along the Atlantic coasts, northward and southward. Some accounts are difficult to verify, but they show how strongly Phoenician and Punic sailors became associated with distant navigation. The temple of Melkart at Gadir became famous. This is important. A temple in a far western colony was more than a religious structure. It was a symbolic anchor. Melkart was the great god of Tyre, To honor him at Gadir was to tie the far west to the mother city across the sea. It told sailors and merchants, "You are far from home, but not beyond the reach of your God." The god traveled with the network, and where the god traveled, identity followed. Gadir must have been full of mixed sounds, Phoenician speech, local Iberian languages, perhaps early Greek words in later periods, the language of bargaining, the gestures of weighing metal, the creak of ships, the calls of seabirds over Atlantic water. The far west enriched the Phoenician world, but it also changed it. Once a people has colonies so far from its homeland, the homeland is no longer the only center. Wealth begins to accumulate elsewhere. Local elites grow confident. Children are born who have never seen Tyre, but still worship Tyrian gods. Their Phoenician identity is real, but transformed by Western soil, Western winds, Western neighbors. This is how diasporas become civilizations of their own. Before Carthage became dominant, another Phoenician foundation in North Africa held great significance. Utica, located not far from where Carthage would later rise, Utica was remembered in ancient tradition as an older Phoenician settlement. Its exact early chronology remains a matter of scholarly caution, but its importance in the Phoenician and later Punic world is clear. North Africa offered advantages that the narrow Levantine homeland did not. There was more land, there were agricultural possibilities. There were harbours facing Sicily, Sardinia, and the western Mediterranean. There were local Libyan and other North African communities with whom Phoenician settlers interacted, traded, and sometimes competed. This coast was not merely a stopping point. It could sustain cities. A Phoenician settlement in North Africa could grow in ways that an island trading post could not. It could cultivate hinterlands, form relationships with inland groups, raise armies, and develop political ambitions beyond commerce. This was one of the great differences between the older Phoenician homeland and the Punic West. The Levantine cities were narrow and pressed by mountains. North African settlements could breathe outward. Carthage would later use this advantage brilliantly. But Utica reminds us that Carthage did not arise in isolation. It belonged to a wider Phoenician presence along the North African shore. It had neighbors, predecessors, rivals, and partners. The Punic West was a constellation before it became a system. At sunset, the North African coast would glow differently from Lebanon. The light would be wider, the land beyond the city more open, the smell of the air warmer, dustier, mixed with sea salt and dry earth. Ships from Tyre or Sidon would arrive bearing eastern goods and news. Local products would move back across the water. Families would settle, adapt, and remember. The Phoenician world was becoming two worlds, the Old East and the rising West. Every colony begins with memory. But if it survives long enough, it begins to have memories of its own. Carthage, the daughter of Tyre, eventually became the greatest Phoenician-founded city in the western Mediterranean. Its location was exceptional. It stood on the Gulf of Tunis, with access to good harbours, fertile lands, and the central sea lanes. From there, it could look north toward Sicily, west toward Sardinia and Iberia, east toward the older Mediterranean routes, and south into the North African interior. At first, it may have depended culturally and emotionally on Tyre. Over time, it became independent in practice, and later still, it became a protector and organizer of other Western Phoenician communities. This transformation did not happen in a single moment. It happened slowly. As Assyria, Babylon, and Persia placed pressure on the Levant, the old Phoenician cities faced constraints. Tyre might remain wealthy and prestigious, but it could not always act freely. Western communities, farther from imperial armies, had more room to develop. Carthage's elite families could build their own networks, secure their own trade routes, and shape their own policy. By the 6th and 5th centuries BC, Carthage was no longer merely a distant daughter. It was a great city in its own right. It had a political system led by magistrates often called suffets, comparable in some ways to judges or chief officials. It had councils and aristocratic families. It had temples, harbours, workshops, markets, and strong naval interests. It relied on trade, agriculture, tribute, alliances, and military force. Unlike Rome, which began as an inland city before mastering the Mediterranean, Carthage was maritime from the beginning. Its identity faced the sea. The famous Kothon of Carthage, the artificial harbour complex known from later descriptions and archaeology, symbolizes this identity powerfully. The military harbour, with its circular arrangement and ship sheds, belongs to the later Punic city, but it expresses a truth that had been growing for centuries. Carthage understood power through ships. A Carthaginian citizen standing near the harbour might see the Mediterranean not as a frontier, but as a possession to be managed. Grain from North Africa, silver from Iberia, timber and manpower from subject territories, strategic islands, fleets, treaties, markets. Carthage inherited Phoenician seafaring and turned it into Western statecraft, but with power came conflict. Greek cities, especially in Sicily, challenged Carthaginian influence. Etruscans, Greeks, local peoples, and later Romans all moved within overlapping zones of trade and ambition. The Western Mediterranean became a competitive world in which commerce and warfare were never fully separate. A trade route might need protection. A colony might need soldiers. A harbour might become a fortress. A market rivalry might become a war. Carthage learnt to fight, and in fighting, it moved farther from the quiet image of Phoenician merchants. Yet even at its most militarized, Carthage remained deeply Phoenician in language, religion, and maritime instinct. It was the old Levantine harbour, magnified under an African sky. The Greeks and Phoenicians encountered one another across many centuries. They traded, they competed, they borrowed, they misunderstood. They told stories about each other. In the early 1st millennium BC, both peoples expanded across the Mediterranean. Greek communities founded colonies in the Aegean, southern Italy, Sicily, the Black Sea, and beyond. Phoenician communities expanded through Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, Iberia, and other regions. Their roots overlapped, especially in the central and western Mediterranean. The relationship was not simply hostile. Greek pottery appears in Phoenician and Punic contexts. Phoenician goods appear in Greek sanctuaries and elite settings. Artistic motifs crossed boundaries. The alphabet passed from Phoenician into Greek adaptation. Myths absorbed memories of Eastern contact. But rivalry grew wherever economic and political interests collided. In Sicily, Greek and Phoenician settlements existed within the same island world. The eastern and southern parts of Sicily became strongly Greek, with powerful cities such as Syracuse, while Phoenician and later Carthaginian influence endured especially in the west. This geography made conflict almost inevitable. To the Greeks, Phoenicians could appear as clever sailors, skilled craftsmen, luxury traders, and sometimes deceitful merchants. Greek literature preserved admiration and suspicion side by side. The figure of the Phoenician trader could be useful, exotic, dangerous, or cunning depending on the story. Such stereotypes reveal as much about Greek anxieties as about Phoenician reality. A trading people often becomes morally ambiguous in the imagination of agricultural or aristocratic societies. They move too easily, they speak too many languages, they know too many ports. They profit from difference. They do not belong entirely to one land. The Phoenicians unsettled people because they were hard to contain. They were not barbarians outside civilization. They were not imperial conquerors in the usual sense. They were insiders everywhere and outsiders everywhere. This made them powerful, and it made them suspect. The Greek adoption of the Phoenician alphabet is one of the most important examples of cultural borrowing in ancient history. Greek tradition remembered this through the myth of Cadmus, the Phoenician who brought letters. Whether or not Cadmus reflects any historical person, the memory is meaningful. The Greeks knew their letters had come from the East. But borrowing does not prevent rivalry. People can learn from one another and still fight. They can admire and mock at the same time. They can trade in the morning and prepare for war by night. The Mediterranean was never a peaceful unity. It was a connected tension. The Phoenicians and Greeks helped create that tension. Together, they opened routes, founded cities, spread scripts, moved goods, and transformed coastlines. And in doing so, they made the ancient Mediterranean more crowded, more literate, more competitive, and more alive. While the western horizon expanded, the Phoenician homeland remained vulnerable to the great powers of the Near East. Assyria was one of the most formidable of these powers. From its heartland in northern Mesopotamia, the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded with disciplined armies, siegecraft, administrative organization, and a political language of fear. Assyrian kings presented themselves as universal rulers, appointed by the gods. Cities that submitted could be incorporated into the imperial order. Cities that resisted risked devastation. The Phoenician cities were valuable to Assyria. They had ships, they had wealth, they had access to luxury goods, they had skilled craftsmen, they had trade networks reaching beyond the direct grasp of land armies. Assyrian kings wanted their tribute. Tribute might include metals, textiles, timber, exotic goods, and other wealth. Submission did not necessarily mean the end of local life. A Phoenician city could continue to trade and maintain local rulers if it acknowledged Assyrian supremacy. But the relationship was unequal and dangerous. Imagine an Assyrian envoy arriving at a coastal city. The Phoenician ruler receives him in a hall scented with cedar and incense. Behind polite words lies fear. Behind tribute lies calculation. How much can be paid without weakening the city? How much resistance is possible? Can the island defenses hold? Will Egypt help? Will neighboring cities betray or support? Phoenician politics often unfolded under such pressure. Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, Arwad. Each had to navigate imperial demands differently. Sometimes cities rebelled, sometimes they submitted. Sometimes one city benefited from the misfortune of another. Local rivalry did not disappear under imperial threat. Assyrian sources often present Phoenician rulers as minor figures bowing before imperial greatness. But that is the Assyrian viewpoint. From the Phoenician side, survival required intelligence. Pay tribute today, preserve the fleet, keep the harbor open, send goods west, wait for the empire to weaken. This was not glorious in the heroic sense, but it was effective. Many empires that dominated Phoenicia vanished. Assyria fell, Babylon fell, Persia fell. The Phoenician cities changed, suffered, adapted, and endured. A cedar bends in the mountain wind. It does not always break. Sidon's history under Assyrian and later Persian pressure shows how dangerous rebellion could be. In the 7th century BC, Sidon suffered severely at the hands of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon after rebellion. Assyrian royal inscriptions describe the defeat of Sidon in brutal imperial language, including destruction and reorganization. Such texts are meant to glorify the king, so their tone is violent and triumphant, but they reflect real trauma for the city. A city is more than walls. When a city is destroyed, lives are uprooted, families are scattered, temples are damaged, workshops fall silent, archives are lost, graves are disturbed, merchants lose partners, children lose homes, yet cities can return. Sidon did not vanish forever. It re-emerged as an important Phoenician city, especially under Persian rule, when it became one of the leading naval contributors to the empire. Its later kings minted coins, built monuments, and participated in the complex politics of the Achaemenid world. This pattern, destruction and return, is common in ancient history. Modern people sometimes imagine ancient cities as fixed monuments, but they were living organisms. They burned and rebuilt. They changed rulers. They shifted alliances. They absorbed migrants. They restored temples. They remembered wounds. Sidon's suffering under Assyria did not erase its identity. It added another layer. A city that has been punished remembers power differently. It may become more cautious, or more resentful, or more determined to use opportunity when it appears. Under Persia, Sidon would again become proud and influential. But pride under empire is always dangerous. After Assyria declined, Babylon rose. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, especially under Nebuchadnezzar II, became the dominant force in much of the Near East. Jerusalem fell to Babylon in the early 6th century BC. The Levant was reorganized under Babylonian power. Phoenician cities again had to adapt. Tyre, with its island defenses, remained especially difficult to subdue. Ancient sources refer to a long Babylonian siege of Tyre. The details are complex, and historians debate exactly what happened and how fully Babylon controlled the city afterward. But the larger truth is certain. Tyre was too important to ignore, and too difficult to conquer easily. Imagine the island city during a long siege. The mainland is watched. The harbors are threatened. Supply routes become uncertain. The city depends on ships, stored food, diplomacy, and endurance. The sea, usually a road of wealth, becomes a contested space. Siege is a slow form of fear. It is not only battle, it is waiting. It is hunger. It is rumor. It is calculation. It is the sound of enemy labor on the shore. It is the question of how long walls and water can protect a city from imperial patience. Tyre survived in some form, but its freedom was constrained. Like other Phoenician cities, it learned that island strength could delay conquest, but not remove the pressure of great empires forever, and yet Tyre's prestige endured. Its god Melkart remained important. Its colonies remembered it. Its purple retained fame. Its name continued to carry weight. The old city on the sea had been bruised, but not forgotten. When the Persian Empire conquered the Near East, Phoenicia became part of the largest empire the region had yet seen. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was vast. It stretched across many peoples, languages, landscapes and traditions. Its rulers governed through satrapies, tribute systems, royal roads, local elites, and a flexible imperial ideology that often allowed subject peoples to retain local customs as long as they served the king. For Persia, the Phoenician cities were especially valuable because of their ships. The Persians were powerful on land, but Mediterranean naval warfare required expertise from maritime peoples. Phoenician fleets became central to Persian operations in the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. During the Greco-Persian Wars, Phoenician ships formed a major part of the Persian navy. This placed Phoenicians in a difficult position. They were serving an empire against Greek cities, with whom they also traded and interacted. But ancient politics rarely followed cultural simplicity. Economic contact did not prevent military service. Subject status demanded obligations. A Phoenician crew rowing under Persian command might not be fighting for an abstract Persian identity. They might be fulfilling the duty of their city. They might be protecting local privileges. They might be obeying their king. They might be seeking pay, status, or survival. History often looks cleaner from far away than it felt to those living inside it. Under Persian rule, some Phoenician cities prospered. Sidon in particular became prominent at times. Phoenician kings issued coinage and maintained local authority. Wealth continued, trade continued, temples continued. But imperial service brought risks. If Persia fought Greece, Phoenician ships might be destroyed in Persian defeats. If a Phoenician city rebelled, Persian punishment could be severe. If local kings grew too ambitious, imperial suspicion could follow. The Persian period was therefore both an age of opportunity and constraint. Phoenicia was not independent in the full sense, but it was not erased. It remained a maritime jewel within an imperial crown. In the 4th century BC, Sidon became the center of a major revolt against Persian authority. The exact sequence of events is known through later sources and must be handled with care, but the broad picture is dramatic. Sidon, under its king Tenes, rebelled against Persia, apparently with support connected to Egypt and wider anti-Persian movements. The Persian response was severe. The city suffered catastrophe. Ancient accounts describe Sidon being burned and many inhabitants dying, though the numbers and details may be exaggerated in classical tradition. Still, the revolt clearly ended disastrously for Sidon. This tragedy reveals the narrow path Phoenician cities walked. They were wealthy enough to matter. They were proud enough to resist. They were exposed enough to be punished. A city like Sidon could not escape imperial politics. Its harbor, ships, and wealth made it important. Its importance made it watched. Its rebellion made it a target. Imagine the fear in the city as Persian forces approached. Families hiding valuables, ships trapped or seized, temple fires burning, leaders arguing, some hoping for rescue, some knowing none would come. A city that had traded across the sea now faced destruction from the land. The Phoenician story is often told through mobility and cleverness, but it also contains moments of helplessness. No civilization, however skilled, controls all forces around it. Sidon would again be rebuilt, but the wound remained part of its history. Soon after, a new power would enter the region, not from Mesopotamia, not from Egypt, not from Persia, from Macedon. Alexander was coming. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great reached Tyre. By then, he had defeated Persian forces in major battles and was moving down the eastern Mediterranean coast. Many cities submitted. Tyre faced a terrible decision. Alexander wanted to enter the city and sacrifice to Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles. For Alexander, who claimed heroic descent and cultivated divine associations, this was not a small request. For Tyre, allowing a foreign conqueror into the island city's most sacred space carried political and religious implications. Tyre refused full entry. Alexander decided to take the city. The siege of Tyre became one of the most famous sieges of the ancient world. Because the main city stood on an island, Alexander could not simply surround it like an inland town. He ordered the construction of a causeway, or mole, from the mainland toward the island. His army used stones and debris from the old mainland settlement to push a road across the water. The Tyrians resisted fiercely, attacking the works, using ships, fire, missiles, and every advantage of their maritime position. The sea itself became a battlefield. Imagine the scene: the island walls rising ahead, Macedonian soldiers hauling stones under fire, engineers building towers, Tyrian ships darting across the water, smoke drifting over the harbour, waves striking the unfinished causeway, men shouting in many languages, the god Melkart watching, silent in his temple. The siege lasted months. Alexander eventually gathered naval support from other Phoenician cities in Cyprus, reducing Tyre's advantage at sea. With fleets, siege engines, and relentless pressure, he finally breached the city. The fall of Tyre was brutal. Ancient sources describe large numbers killed or enslaved, though exact figures are uncertain and may reflect the dramatic style of conquest narratives. What is certain is that the city suffered greatly. The island that had resisted Assyria, endured Babylonian pressure, and stood as a symbol of Phoenician maritime pride finally fell to a Macedonian king who turned land into sea and sea into road. The causeway changed Tyre forever. Over time, silt accumulated around it, and the former island became connected to the mainland. Geography itself was altered by conquest. This is one of the most powerful images in Phoenician history. A city whose strength was separation, a conqueror who erased the separation, a maritime civilization overcome by an army that learned to build across water. And yet Tyre did not disappear. It survived under Hellenistic and later Roman rule. Its people continued. Its traditions changed. Its name remained. History rarely ends as completely as conquerors claim. Even after the walls fall, memory keeps moving. After Alexander's conquests, the Eastern Mediterranean entered the Hellenistic Age. Greek language and culture spread through new kingdoms founded by Alexander's successors. Cities were reorganized, new settlements were built, trade routes shifted, elites adapted to Greek styles, institutions, and political language. Phoenician cities became part of this Hellenistic world. But Hellenization did not mean instant replacement. Phoenician language, religion, and local identity continued for a time. Inscriptions show coexistence and blending. Greek names and forms appeared alongside older traditions. Gods were identified with Greek equivalents. Local elites learnt to operate in a Greek-speaking political environment while preserving elements of civic heritage. A temple could still honor an old deity under a new interpreted name. A family could bear both local and Greek-style names. A city could mint coins using imagery meaningful to several audiences. A harbor could welcome merchants speaking Greek, Phoenician, Aramaic, Egyptian, and other languages. The Phoenicians had always been translators. Now they translated themselves into a Hellenistic world. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and other cities remained important, though no longer as independent maritime powers in the old style. The center of Phoenician-derived power had already shifted westward to Carthage. The eastern cities became ancient, prestigious, but politically constrained members of larger kingdoms and later empires. Still, their legacy continued. The alphabet had already traveled, the colonies had already been founded, the goods had already crossed the sea, the gods had already taken root in new soils. By the time Greek kings ruled the eastern Mediterranean, Phoenician influence was no longer contained in Phoenicia. It was everywhere, in letters, in cities, in myths, in trade habits, in Western settlements, in the identity of Carthage. A civilization can lose political independence and still remain one of the foundations of the world that follows. The word Punic describes the Western Phoenician world, especially Carthage and its cultural sphere. Punic civilization was not identical to the older Phoenician cities of the Levant, but it grew from them. Its language descended from Phoenician. Its gods preserved and transformed Phoenician religious traditions. Its merchants inherited maritime skills. Its settlements stretched across North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, the Balearic Islands, and Iberia. In the West, Phoenician identity became something broader and more regional. A person in Carthage might never have seen Tyre. A family in Sardinia might have mixed Phoenician and local ancestry. A merchant in Gardea might deal more often with Iberian communities than with Levantine ones. A soldier in a Carthaginian army might be Libyan, Iberian, Numidian, Sardinian, Greek, or from another background entirely. Punic culture was connected, layered, and adaptive. Carthage stood at its center, but it did not erase all local differences. The Punic world was a network of cities, territories, allies, subjects, markets, and sacred places. It was held together by trade, naval power, religious ties, elite interests, and sometimes force. The Western Phoenician world also became more territorial than the old Levantine model. Carthage controlled land in North Africa and influenced agricultural production. It developed relationships with inland communities. It recruited armies. It negotiated treaties. It fought wars. It became not merely a commercial city, but a state. This shift changed the old Phoenician pattern. The early Phoenician cities survived by moving between empires. Carthage became an empire of its own kind. Not an empire like Persia, not an empire like Rome, but a maritime and commercial power with territorial interests, naval strength, and political ambition. The daughter had become a queen. Before Rome became dominant, the Western Mediterranean was a balance of several powers. Greek cities held strong positions in Sicily and southern Italy. Etruscan cities influenced parts of Italy and the Tyrrhenian Sea. Indigenous peoples across Iberia, Sardinia, Sicily, North Africa, and other regions pursued their own interests. Carthage maintained networks of settlements, alliances, and trade routes. This was not a world waiting for Rome. It was already complex. Carthage signed treaties with Rome before the Punic Wars, suggesting that the two powers initially recognized zones of interest and rules for interaction. Rome was still growing in Italy, while Carthage was already a great maritime power. Their early relationship was not inevitable hatred. It was cautious diplomacy. Carthage's power rested on several foundations. Its navy protected commerce and projected strength. Its merchants connected markets. Its North African lands produced food and wealth. Its western holdings gave access to metals and manpower. Its aristocratic families shaped policy through competition and ambition. Yet Carthage also had weaknesses. It often relied on mercenary or allied troops, rather than a citizen army in the Roman style. Its political system could be divided by elite rivalries. Its overseas interests were wide and difficult to defend. Its subject peoples did not always feel loyal. Its wealth made it powerful, but wealth alone does not guarantee unity. Rome, by contrast, developed a system that turned Italian allies into a deep reservoir of manpower. Rome could lose armies and raise more. Carthage could win brilliant victories and still struggle to turn them into final political outcomes. But before that conflict reached its height, Carthage had already spent centuries shaping the West. It had made the Punic language heard across coasts. It had built sanctuaries. It had spread agricultural knowledge. It had carried Phoenician gods into Africa, Iberia, and the islands. It had inherited the maritime courage of Tyre and Sidon. To understand Carthage, we must remember the long road behind it. The Cedar Mountains, the purple dye workshops, the alphabet, the island city of Tyre, the western colony that grew beyond its mother. Carthage was not an isolated rival of Rome. It was the strongest surviving expression of Phoenician civilization in the West. The First Punic War began in 2064 BC. It was, at its heart, a struggle over Sicily and control of the central Mediterranean. Sicily had long been divided among different powers: Greek cities, local communities, and Carthaginian-held areas in the west. Rome's growing power in Italy eventually brought it into Sicilian affairs. What began as intervention in a local conflict expanded into a long war between Rome and Carthage. For Carthage, Sicily was familiar ground. It had been part of the Western Phoenician Punic sphere for centuries. For Rome, Sicily was a new kind of challenge. Rome was strong on land, but Carthage was the great naval power. The war forced Rome to learn the sea. According to ancient accounts, the Romans built fleets and developed tactics to overcome their lack of maritime tradition, including the use of the corvus, a boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into something closer to land combat. The details of its use and effectiveness are debated, but the broader point stands. Rome adapted quickly. Carthage fought with experience. Rome fought with stubbornness. The war lasted more than 20 years. Ships burned. Fleets were wrecked by storms. Armies struggled in Sicily. Treasuries emptied. Generations of sailors and soldiers endured a conflict that neither side could easily end. Imagine a Punic sailor in this war. He comes from a family of seafarers. He knows the smell of pitch and salt. He has heard stories of Tyre, perhaps as a distant ancestral memory. Now he rows or commands under the sign of Carthage, facing Roman ships crewed by men whose fathers may never have dreamed of naval empire. The old Phoenician advantage is being challenged. Rome is learning. This is one of history's most dangerous moments for any specialized civilization. when a rival begins to master the thing that made you unique. After long struggle, Rome won. Carthage lost Sicily. It also faced a heavy indemnity. Soon after, Rome took Sardinia and Corsica in circumstances Carthaginians considered deeply unjust. Carthage was wounded, but not destroyed, and in that wound, a new path opened toward Iberia. After the First Punic War, Carthage needed wealth, manpower, and renewed strength. Iberia offered all three. The Barcid family, beginning with Hamilcar Barca and then Hasdrubal the Fair, expanded Carthaginian power in Spain. This was not merely trade anymore. It was territorial and military expansion. Iberia provided silver mines, soldiers, and a new base of power. The city of New Carthage, or Court Hadasht in Punic, later Cartagena, became a major center. The name Court Hadasht means new city. It was the same meaning as Carthage itself. A new city in Africa, a new city in Spain. Phoenician naming echoed across the west. In Iberia, Punic power interacted with diverse local peoples. Some became allies, some resisted, some served in armies. Cultural exchange and coercion existed side by side. The Barcid project made Carthage dangerous again, and from this world emerged Hannibal. Hannibal Barca was not simply a brilliant general who appeared from nowhere. He was the heir of a long history: Phoenician seafaring, Punic statecraft, Carthaginian resentment, Barcid ambition, Iberian resources, and Roman rivalry. His famous march over the Alps belongs to Roman and Carthaginian history. But behind it stands Tyre. Behind Hannibal's name stands Baal. Behind his army stands the Western network. Behind his hatred of Rome stands the memory of lost Sicily and humiliation. Behind his strategy stands a civilization that had always known how to move across impossible spaces. The Phoenicians crossed seas, Hannibal crossed mountains. Different roads, same inheritance of audacity. Hannibal's war against Rome, the Second Punic War, began in 218 BC. It became one of the most dramatic conflicts in ancient history. Hannibal led an army from Iberia, across southern Gaul, over the Alps, and into Italy. His force included infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and troops from many backgrounds. The crossing itself became legendary, not because it was easy, but because it was almost unthinkable. For years, Hannibal defeated Roman armies in Italy. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, most famously at Cannae, where Roman forces suffered one of the most devastating defeats in their history. Yet Rome did not surrender. This is the tragic tension of Hannibal's story. He could win battles of genius, but he could not break Rome's political will. Carthage could produce a commander of extraordinary brilliance. Rome could absorb catastrophe and continue. The Second Punic War eventually turned against Carthage. Roman strategy under Scipio Africanus brought the war to North Africa. Hannibal was recalled. At Zama in 202 BC, he was defeated. Carthage lost its overseas empire, its fleet was limited, and its independence was severely constrained. For the Phoenician story, Hannibal is both central and distant. He belongs to the Punic world, not to the old Phoenician homeland. He spoke a language descended from Phoenician. He bore a name invoking Baal. He came from a civilization founded by Tyrian colonists. He fought Rome not as a Levantine merchant, but as the general of a Western power. Yet the deep line remains. The same Mediterranean that carried cedar and purple cloth now carried armies and revenge. The same colonial networks that began as trading routes became military systems. The same Carthage that began as a daughter of Tyre became Rome's greatest enemy. History is transformation. A harbour becomes a colony becomes a power becomes a rival becomes a memory. After the Second Punic War, Carthage was weakened, but not dead. It recovered economically in impressive ways, especially through agriculture and trade. But Rome watched it with suspicion. In Roman political culture, Carthage became a symbol of danger, even when its military power had been reduced. The famous phrase associated with Cato the Elder, that Carthage must be destroyed, captures this Roman fear and determination. Whether or not every detail of the tradition is exact, the Third Punic War began in 149 BC. It ended in 46 BC, with the destruction of Carthage. The siege was bitter. Carthaginians resisted desperately. When the city finally fell, Roman forces destroyed it as a political power. Many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. The city's independent life ended. Later stories claimed that Rome sowed the ground with salt, but this is not considered a reliable ancient fact. It is a later legend, a symbolic exaggeration of total destruction. The real destruction was severe enough without the myth. Carthage fell, and with it, the greatest Punic state disappeared. But Punic culture did not vanish overnight. This is important. Languages do not disappear the moment a city falls. Religious habits do not end in a single year. Rural communities continue. Families continue. Names continue. Local traditions continue beneath new rulers. Rome later rebuilt Carthage as a Roman city, and it became one of the great urban centers of Roman North Africa. But beneath Roman Carthage lay Punic memory. In North Africa, Punic language and identity endured for centuries in various forms. Even in the time of Augustine, many centuries later, traces of Punic speech and identity remained in the region. Political Carthage died in 1406 BC. Punic life faded much more slowly. That fading is quieter than war. It happens in households, in names no longer given, in gods renamed, in inscriptions changing language, in children learning Latin instead of Punic, in old stories told less often. Civilizations rarely end all at once. They dissolve into those that follow. Under Roman rule, the old Phoenician and Punic worlds were absorbed into new structures. In the Levant, cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus continued under Hellenistic and then Roman influence. They retained local prestige, religious traditions, and commercial activity, but they were now part of larger imperial systems. In North Africa, Roman Carthage rose again as a great city, but with Roman institutions, Latin language, and imperial architecture. Yet the population was not simply replaced. Local people, Punic descendants, Libyans, settlers, veterans, merchants, and others formed the layered society of Roman Africa. Punic names and religious traditions continued in adapted forms. Bel-Hammon could be associated with Saturn. Tanit and other deities could be interpreted through Roman religious language. This process, often called syncretism, did not mean people forgot their past immediately. It meant they expressed it through new frameworks. An old god wearing a new name is still carrying memory. The Phoenician alphabet itself had already given birth to other scripts. Its direct use declined, but its descendants flourished. Greek, Latin, Aramaic-derived scripts, Hebrew developments, and others belong to a wider family of alphabetic history in which Phoenician occupies a central place. Rome conquered Carthage, but Rome wrote with letters descended, through long pathways, from Phoenician signs. This is one of history's quiet ironies. The victor destroys the city, but the victor's own writing carries the defeated people's legacy. No conquest is complete enough to erase influence, because the Phoenicians left no surviving national history of their own. Archaeology is essential. Archaeologists study settlements, cemeteries, temples, pottery, shipwrecks, inscriptions, harbors, industrial areas, and trade goods. Each discovery adds detail to a story once known mostly through outsiders. A Phoenician or Punic site can reveal diet, burial customs, trade links, craft production, religious practice, and urban planning. Pottery styles can trace movement. Inscriptions can preserve names and dedications. Isotopic and scientific analyses can reveal origins of materials, human mobility, and economic patterns. Shipwrecks are especially powerful. A wreck is a frozen voyage. Cargo that was meant to move becomes still. Amphorae rest on the seafloor. Metal ingots lie where the ship sank. The hull decays but leaves traces. Objects meant for trade become evidence for historians thousands of years later. Underwater archaeology has helped us understand ancient maritime exchange in ways earlier scholars could only imagine. The sea, which once concealed Phoenician movement, now preserves parts of it. On land, places like Motia in Sicily, Carthage in Tunisia, Cadiz in Spain, and sites in Sardinia, Malta, Cyprus, and Lebanon continue to shape modern understanding. Each site has its own problems of preservation, excavation, politics, and interpretation. Modern Lebanon's ancient cities are living places, not empty ruins. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre have modern communities, later layers, and complex histories beyond the Phoenician period. Carthage lies within the landscape of modern Tunisia, where Punic, Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, Islamic, and modern histories overlap. Archaeology does not recover a pure frozen past. It works through layers, and the Phoenicians were always a layered people, so perhaps this is fitting. What then did the Phoenicians give the world? They gave no single empire that lasted unchanged for centuries. They gave no vast surviving library in their own language. They gave no simple story of one people marching under one banner. Instead, they gave connection. They helped connect the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. They spread goods, styles, technologies, religious practices, and writing habits. They founded cities that transformed history. They preserved and adapted older Canaanite traditions. They turned narrow coastlines into global routes for their time. They made the sea into a road. Their alphabetic script became one of the foundations of later writing systems. Their colonies carried Levantine culture into North Africa, Iberia, and the islands. Their artisans shaped the visual language of luxury across empires. Their sailors expanded the known horizons of Mediterranean peoples. Their greatest western daughter, Carthage, reshaped the history of Rome. The Phoenicians remind us that power does not always look like conquest. Sometimes power is a harbour. Sometimes it is a contract. Sometimes it is a letter. Sometimes it is a colour extracted from a shell. Sometimes it is a god carried to a new shore. Sometimes it is the ability to survive between larger forces. Sometimes it is the patience to learn the wind. A civilization can be small in land and enormous in reach. Phoenicia was small. Its wake was vast. And now, as the night deepens, let us return to the harbour where we began. The sea is dark. The mountains are almost invisible. The lamps of the city tremble in the wind. A ship rocks gently against its ropes. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once and falls silent. A watchman walks along the wall. A merchant sleeps beside unfinished accounts. A child dreams of a city beyond the sea. A sailor, leaving at dawn, looks up at the stars. He does not know that future centuries will call his people Phoenicians. He does not know that scholars will debate his language, his gods, his trade routes, his city, his identity. He does not know that the letters scratched by men like him will echo through Greek and Latin and into worlds he cannot imagine. He does not know that Carthage will rise, fight Rome, and fall. He does not know that Tyre will be besieged by Alexander. He does not know that purple will become the colour of emperors. He knows the wind. He knows the cargo. He knows the harbour mouth. He knows the prayer he must say before departure. That is enough. History is often made by people who do not know they are making it. A sailor follows a coastline. A scribe shapes a letter. A dyer watches a colour deepen. A merchant trusts a distant cousin. A colonist builds a shrine. A city sends a ship. And slowly, quietly, the world changes. So let the Phoenician sea grow soft now in your mind. Let the oars move without urgency. Let the cedar hull glide over dark water. Let the stars hold their ancient positions. Let the coast fade behind you. You are not lost. You are only travelling. Across the old Mediterranean, across memory, across the gentle darkness between mountain and sea. To imagine Phoenician life clearly, we must return again to the physical city. Not the city as a name in a list. Not Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos as distant labels in a textbook. But the city as a place of stone, timber, heat, salt, shadow, and sound. Phoenician cities grew where geography allowed them to breathe. Sometimes they occupied small coastal plains. Sometimes they rose against hillsides. Sometimes they spread across islands or promontories. Sometimes they developed around harbours that were partly natural and partly improved by human labour. A Phoenician city was not built as a rigid geometric dream. It was shaped by terrain. The coast curved. The rock projected. The harbour offered shelter. The hill gave defence. The temple claimed height. The market gathered near traffic. The houses pressed close together because land was precious. In a place like Tyre, space was especially valuable. The island city could not expand endlessly. Its walls, harbours, temples, workshops and houses all had to fit within a limited area. Density gave energy, but also pressure. People lived close to one another. Sounds carried, smells lingered. Workplaces and homes often stood near each other. The sea surrounded everything. Imagine walking through such a city in the late afternoon. The sun is lowering. The stone walls hold warmth. Narrow streets twist between plastered buildings. A doorway opens onto a courtyard where grain is being ground. A staircase leads to a roof where jars dry in the air. A merchant's house has storage rooms below and family rooms above. Children move through alleys carrying small baskets. A donkey is led carefully through a tight passage. The distant harbour noise rises and falls like another kind of tide. In the lower parts of the city, near the water, the commercial life is most intense. Warehouses stand near quays, goods are counted and sealed, amphorae are stacked, ropes hang from beams, sailcloth is repaired, wooden hulls are scraped and treated, foreign merchants seek lodging or introductions. Weights and measures pass from hand to hand. The harbour is not separate from the city. It is the city's breathing mouth. Through it come food, wealth, danger, news, and strangers. Through it leave sons, brothers, fathers, cargo, prayers, and ambition. Above the commercial zone, temples occupy prominent positions. Ancient temples were not simply quiet devotional spaces. They could be economic institutions, storehouses of prestige, centers of civic identity, and places where the community negotiated its relationship with the divine. A Phoenician temple might hold offerings from sailors who survived storms, merchants who returned from profitable journeys, families thanking a deity for healing, rulers displaying piety, or craftsmen presenting the finest products of their hands: stone, bronze, incense, oil, music, flame. All of it belonged to the city's rhythm. The architecture of Phoenician cities was often less monumental in surviving remains than that of Egypt or Mesopotamia, partly because of geography, later destruction, continuous occupation, and the perishable nature of some materials. But this should not mislead us. A city does not need colossal pyramids to be sophisticated. Sophistication can appear in harbours, in drainage channels, in storage systems, in fortifications, in urban density, in careful use of limited space, in the ability to connect production, worship, trade, and defense within one living organism. Phoenician cities were practical, adaptive, and alive. They were not built to impress a distant tourist after 3,000 years. They were built to function, to receive ships, to protect people, to honor gods, to store goods, to make profit, to survive empires. And in that sense, their architecture expressed their soul. Let us stay in the harbour for a while. Night falls differently over a port city. Inland, darkness may bring stillness quickly. Fields empty, roads grow quiet, villages withdraw into firelight. But a harbour never fully sleeps. Even when trade pauses, the sea moves. Ropes strain, hulls creak, watchmen listen, dogs bark at unfamiliar footsteps. A lamp burns in a warehouse, where cargo must be guarded until dawn. The Phoenician harbour at night is a place of soft danger. The moon lays a silver path across the water. The silhouettes of masts tremble against the sky. Small waves tap against stone quays. The smell of salt mingles with pitch, fish, wet wood, smoke, and old dye. A sailor sits on a coil of rope, repairing a strap by lamplight. A young apprentice carries a jar of water to men sleeping beside the cargo. A merchant checks a seal one last time, though he has already checked it twice. An old man watches the stars, judging tomorrow's wind. Some ships will leave before sunrise. This means work begins in darkness. Cargo must be balanced carefully. A badly loaded ship can become unstable. Amphorae must be secured so they do not break in rough water. Heavy goods must be placed low. Valuable goods must be protected. Food and water must be stored. Ropes must be tested. Sails must be ready. The hull must be inspected. The captain must speak with the merchant, the crew, and perhaps a priest. Nothing about ancient sailing is casual. A single mistake can become disaster. A cracked jar can spoil goods. A rotten rope can fail under stress. A misread wind can push the ship off course. A careless departure can anger investors, officials, family, and gods alike. So the harbour moves with quiet discipline, not the discipline of an army on parade, the discipline of people who know the sea does not forgive arrogance. Before dawn, a small offering may be made. A few words to Melkart, a prayer to Baal, a vow to Astarte, a request to whatever divine power guards sailors beyond the visible coast. Ancient sailors did not think of religion as separate from navigation. A safe voyage required skill, yes. It required experience, yes. It required good wood, good rope, and good judgment. But it also required favour. No one controls the sea completely. Even now, with engines and satellites, storms still humble ships. In the ancient world, the humility was sharper, and so the Phoenician sailor looked at the dark water not as empty space, but as a living uncertainty. The harbour was safety. The open sea was possibility. Between them lay the moment of departure, a moment every maritime people understands. The rope is released. The hull shifts. The land begins to move away. Faces on shore grow smaller. the city becomes a line of lamps, then a shadow, then memory. Among all Phoenician industries, none became more famous than purple dye. The phrase Tyrian purple still carries a kind of royal weight. It suggests emperors, kings, priests, wealth, ceremony, and sacred authority. But the making of purple was not gentle. It was laborious, messy, and intensely physical. The dye came from certain marine mollusks, especially murex snails. These small creatures lived along rocky coasts. To produce significant quantities of dye, workers needed enormous numbers of shells. The process involved collecting, crushing, extracting, fermenting, heating, timing, and exposing the material in ways that transformed it into colors ranging from reddish tones to deep purple. The exact procedures varied and remain partly reconstructed through ancient descriptions, archaeology, and experimental work. But one thing is clear: this was not a clean luxury born in silence. It began with smell. Piles of shells near the shore, organic matter breaking down, vats filled with liquid in different stages of transformation, workers handling materials that elite wearers of the finished cloth would never want to see. A royal cloak begins in a workshop most nobles would avoid. This contrast is one of the strange beauties of history. Prestige often hides labor. The finished purple cloth might appear in a palace, a temple procession, a diplomatic gift, or the wardrobe of a ruler. It might be admired under sunlight. Its color deep and difficult to imitate, it might signal access to long-distance trade and specialized knowledge. But behind it stand anonymous workers, men and women gathering shells, hands stained by dye, eyes watching color change, bodies enduring smell and heat, merchants calculating cost, officials taxing production, sailors carrying the finished textiles abroad. Purple was expensive because it concentrated labor, rarity, and skill into color. The Phoenicians understood that luxury is not only material, it is story. A dyed cloth told a story before anyone spoke. It said that the wearer possessed something difficult to obtain. It said that sea creatures had been gathered by the thousands. It said that craftsmen knew secrets of transformation. It said that ships had carried value across water. It said that the color itself had survived washing, sunlight, and time better than ordinary dyes. Color became authority, and Tyre became inseparable from that color. Imagine the dye quarter outside, or near the city, perhaps placed where the smell could be tolerated more easily. Though ancient cities often endured smells modern people would find overwhelming, the workers begin before the heat becomes too strong. Shells clatter into baskets. Stone tools strike. Liquid darkens. Steam rises. The sea glitters nearby, indifferent. From this rough and pungent world comes the color of kings. The Phoenicians, more than most, knew how to turn the humble and hidden into the rare and desired. The cedar forests of Lebanon were among the great natural treasures of the ancient Near East. Cedar wood was valued not only because it was beautiful and fragrant, but because it was durable, workable, and symbolically powerful. Kings wanted cedar for temples, palaces, doors, roofs, ships, coffins, and monuments. The tree itself became a sign of height, strength, and divine or royal favor. For Phoenician cities, cedar was both resource and identity. The mountains behind the coast provided what the sea required. Ships begin in forests. Before a hull touches water, trees must be chosen. Wood must be cut, shaped, seasoned, transported, and joined. Shipbuilding is one of humanity's most complex ancient crafts. It requires knowledge of materials, geometry, balance, water resistance, storage, propulsion, and repair. A Phoenician shipwright was not merely a carpenter. He was an engineer of survival. He had to know which timber bent well, which held strength, which resisted rot, which could form ribs, planking, masts, oars, or beams. He had to understand how a vessel would behave under cargo, wind, waves, and strain. He had to build not for still water, but for a moving, hostile element. Ships were built from many materials. Cedar might be prized, but other woods and imported materials could also be used depending on availability and function. Rope, sailcloth, pitch, resin, metal fastenings, stone anchors, and tools all belonged to the shipbuilding world. The finished vessel carried the memory of every craft that made it. The forester, the cutter, the hauler, the carpenter, the rope maker, the sail maker, the metal worker, the painter, the priest who blessed it, the merchant who financed it, the captain who trusted it. A ship was a community before it had a crew. Phoenician merchant ships needed cargo space and stability. Warships needed speed, crews, and tactical design. Over time, Mediterranean naval technology evolved, and Phoenician expertise became highly respected. Their ships served not only Phoenician cities, but also larger empires such as Persia. But perhaps the most important quality of Phoenician ships was not their form alone. It was how they were used. A ship is only as powerful as the network it enters. The Phoenicians knew where to sail. They knew where to stop. They knew who would buy. They knew which gods guarded which harbor. They knew which winds could be trusted. They knew which coasts offered water. They knew where danger waited. The ship was the visible object. The invisible system was knowledge. And knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to another, was the true vessel of Phoenician power. Ancient navigation was an art of attention. Without compasses in the modern sense, without clocks for longitude, without printed charts, without engines, sailors relied on the world itself. They watched the coast. They studied winds. They remembered currents. They followed birds. They read clouds. They used stars. They measured distance by experience rather than instruments. For Mediterranean sailors, coastal navigation was often preferred when possible. A coastline offered landmarks, shelter, and orientation. But routes between islands and across open stretches required greater confidence. The Phoenicians became famous for this confidence. Later Greeks associated them with celestial navigation, including the use of the northern stars. Whether every detail of these later traditions can be taken literally is less important than the reputation itself. The Phoenicians were remembered as people who knew how to cross water. Imagine a clear night at sea. The ship moves gently. The sail is dark against the stars. Most of the crew sleeps in uneasy fragments, but someone must always watch. The captain studies the sky. The stars are not decorative. They are information. A modern person may look up and see beauty. The ancient navigator sees direction, season, latitude and rough feeling, warning, memory. The same stars seen over Tyre are seen later over Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia and Gadea, though they shift in height and pattern as the ship moves. The sky becomes a map that cannot be stolen, though it can be hidden by clouds. Clouded nights are different. The sailor listens then. He listens to water. He feels wind. He smells land if land is near. He watches the behavior of the sea. He remembers how long the ship has been moving and in what direction. Navigation is not one skill. It is many small skills braided together. And because mistakes could be fatal, knowledge was precious. A route might be a family asset. A hidden anchorage might be guarded information. The location of metals, friendly communities, dangerous reefs, or reliable springs could make the difference between profit and ruin. Phoenician secrecy became a theme in ancient writing. Greek and Roman authors sometimes imagined Phoenician or Carthaginian sailors guarding their routes jealously. Some stories may be exaggerated, but the logic is real. Commercial knowledge is power. If you know the way to silver, you do not casually give the map to a rival. The sea looks open, but knowledge makes parts of it private. The Phoenician alphabet was elegant because it was practical. A civilization of trade needs memory beyond the human mind. Who owns this shipment? How many jars were loaded? Which family financed the voyage? What offering was promised if the ship returned? Which goods have already been taxed? Which partner owes silver? Which cargo belongs to the temple? Disappears. Writing remains. A Phoenician scribe did not always write literature, at least not in the surviving evidence. He wrote usefulness, names, dedications, marks, accounts, labels, contracts, and records. This practical writing may seem humble, but it is one of the foundations of complex exchange. Imagine a counting room near the harbour. It is shaded from the heat. Light enters through a small opening. A low table holds weights, seals, tablets, scraps, and writing tools. A merchant speaks quickly. A scribe listens, repeats, and marks. Goods are identified by origin, quantity, owner, and destination. Mistakes matter. One wrong number can create conflict. One unclear mark can lose property. One forgotten debt can damage trust. The scribe's calm hand protects the network. In a world of movement, writing creates stability. Letters also allow identity to travel. A name carved into stone in Cyprus or Sardinia can tell us that a Phoenician-speaking person stood there, dedicated something, owned something, mourned someone, or wanted to be remembered. A short inscription may be all that remains of a life, but a short inscription is not nothing. It says, "I was here. I belonged to this god. I bore this name. I spoke through these letters. For a people whose great histories are lost, even a few words become precious. And the alphabet, by making words portable, helped Phoenician identity survive across distance. A merchant in Gadir and a priest in Tyre could recognize the same signs. A dedication in Malta and a mark in Cyprus could belong to the same written tradition. Letters made the scattered world feel connected. How did a young Phoenician learn? Not in a modern schoolroom with rows of desks, but through household, workshop, temple, and harbour. A child born into a merchant family might learn weights, names of ports, basic writing, languages useful in trade, and the habits of negotiation. A child in a craft family might learn by watching hands, how to carve ivory, shape metal, weave cloth, prepare dye, form pottery, or repair tools. A child connected to temple service might learn rituals, offerings, songs, names of gods, and sacred obligations. Education was apprenticeship to a world. The harbour itself was a teacher. A boy carrying water might hear sailors speak of Cyprus. A girl helping with textiles might learn which dyes were most valued by foreign buyers. A young assistant might watch a merchant refuse a bad weight. A future scribe might trace letter forms again and again until the hand remembered them. Learning in ancient societies was often intimate and repetitive, not abstract first, practical first. Tie this knot, hold this tool, repeat this prayer, copy this sign, measure this jar, listen before you speak. Do not trust a wet rope, do not insult a local ruler, do not sail after the season has turned, do not forget the God who brought your father home. Such lessons are rarely written down, but they shape civilizations. A maritime culture survives because children learn before they understand the full importance of what they are learning. By the time they are adults, the knowledge feels natural. Of course one checks the wind. Of course one weighs silver carefully. Of course one honors Melkart before a long voyage. Of course one knows that a ship from Sardinia may bring different news than a ship from Egypt. Culture is what becomes obvious to those raised inside it. The Phoenician child grew up in a world where the sea was obvious. Dangerous, yes. Sacred, yes. Profitable, yes. But obvious. The sea was not elsewhere. It was home. Great civilizations are often remembered by rare objects. Purple cloth, carved ivory, silver treasure, royal inscriptions, warships, temples. But most life is ordinary. People must eat. A Phoenician table depended on local agriculture, fishing, trade, and household labor. Bread, olives, olive oil, wine, legumes, fruits, vegetables, fish, and meat when available would have formed part of the broader Levantine and Mediterranean diet. The exact diet varied by class, region, season, and period. The wealthy ate differently from the poor. A sailor at sea ate differently from a temple official. A farmer inland ate differently from a merchant in Tyre. A Punic family in North Africa might have access to different foods than a household in Byblos. Still, we can imagine the textures. Flatbread warm from a hearth, olives in a small bowl, fish salted or fresh, lentils simmered slowly, figs dried for storage, dates in Western or Southern contexts, wine mixed and poured, oil shining on food in lamplight. Markets brought together the ordinary and the exotic. A market near a Phoenician harbour might sell local fish beside imported pottery, simple tools beside luxury beads, grain beside dyed cloth, incense beside onions, and foreign trinkets beside household necessities. The market was a theatre of voices, prices argued, languages mixed, animals complained, children watched, old women judged quality with sharper eyes than any official, merchants exaggerated, customers doubted, scribes recorded, thieves waited. Trade was not only grand overseas commerce, it was also the daily exchange of bread, oil, salt, cloth, and trust. A civilization that connects continents still depends on breakfast, and perhaps this is one of the best ways to make the Phoenicians human again. Before they were masters of the Mediterranean, they were people waking before dawn. They were hungry, they were tired, they were proud, they were worried about debts. They wanted children to survive, they wanted voyages to return, they wanted gods to listen. They wanted bread to rise. The ancient world becomes less distant when we remember the table. Clothing in the Phoenician world, as in all ancient societies, communicated status, occupation, wealth, gender, ritual role, and cultural contact. Most garments were made from wool or linen, depending on availability and context. Textiles were valuable because they required labor at every stage, raising sheep or growing flax, preparing fibers, spinning thread, weaving cloth, dyeing, cutting, sewing, and maintaining garments. A piece of cloth could represent many hours of work. A finely dyed garment could represent extraordinary expense. This is why purple mattered so much. In a world where most colors faded, where dyes varied in quality, and where labor was visible in cloth, a rich purple textile announced power without needing words. But not everyone wore purple. Most people wore simpler garments in natural or more common dyed tones. Workers needed practical clothing. Sailors needed garments that could endure salt, wind, and labor. Craftsmen wore what suited the workshop. Priests and elites may have worn special garments for ritual or public display. Jewelry also communicated identity and status. Beads, amulets, rings, seals, earrings, and necklaces could serve as ornament, protection, wealth storage, and personal expression. Phoenician craftsmen were skilled in producing attractive small objects that traveled widely. A seal ring, for example, was not merely decoration. It could mark ownership, authenticate goods, and display identity. Appearance mattered in trade. A merchant arriving in a foreign port needed to look credible. Too poor, and partners might distrust his capacity. Too extravagant, and he might attract thieves or resentment. Clothing, speech, companions, and gifts all formed part of negotiation. The Phoenicians understood surfaces. This does not mean they were superficial. It means they knew that surfaces carry messages. A dyed cloth, a polished bowl, a carved ivory, a well-built ship, a clean seal, a temple offering, a diplomatic gift. In a world of many languages, objects spoke. The Phoenician world was not silent. We often approach ancient peoples through ruins, and ruins are quiet. Stones do not sing unless we imagine the voices that once moved between them. But Phoenician cities would have been full of music, work songs, temple chants, festival processions, wedding music, funeral laments, sailors' rhythms, children's games, market cries that almost become melody. In religious life, music likely played an important role, as it did across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. Instruments such as lyres, flutes, drums, cymbals, and other forms of percussion and stringed instruments belonged to the wider soundscape of the region. A festival for a city god would transform urban space. The temple doors open. Incense rises. Offerings are prepared. Priests move in ordered sequence. Families gather. Merchants sponsor dedications. Musicians play. The god's presence is honored through food, scent, sound, flame, and procession. In Tyre, Melkart's cult was central to civic identity. In Sidon, Eshmun's healing power mattered deeply. In other cities, other divine forms shaped local ritual life. Across colonies, familiar rituals helped settlers maintain continuity in foreign landscapes. Festival time also reinforced community. People saw who gave generously. They saw which families held status. They remembered myths. They renewed vows. They asked protection for the sailing season. They mourned, celebrated, and belonged. Religion was not merely belief inside the mind. It was public rhythm. The calendar itself could be sacred. Seasons of sailing, seasons of harvest, seasons of danger, seasons of festival. A Phoenician city breathed through these cycles. At night, after a festival, the streets would slowly empty. The last drums fade. The last lamp flickers. The scent of sacrifice, incense, flowers, oil, and smoke lingers in the stone. The god has been honored. The city sleeps, and beyond the harbor, the sea waits for morning. Greek myth preserved several figures connected with Phoenicia. Two of the most famous are Cadmus and Europa. Europa, in Greek myth, was a Phoenician princess carried away by Zeus in the form of a bull. Her story became one of the mythic explanations for the naming of Europe. Cadmus, often described as her brother, wandered in search of her, and eventually founded Thebes in Greece. He was also credited with bringing letters to the Greeks. These stories are not historical records in the simple sense, but myths can preserve memories of contact. They show that the Greeks imagined important cultural beginnings as coming from the Phoenician East. A woman from Phoenicia becomes connected with Europe itself. A Phoenician prince brings writing. A foreign wanderer founds a Greek city. Myth turns trade and transmission into family drama. The sea crossing becomes abduction. The alphabet becomes a hero's gift. Cultural borrowing becomes genealogy. This is how ancient peoples often explain deep connections whose real mechanisms were too gradual, too collective, or too old to remember clearly. No single Cadmus carried the alphabet in one heroic gesture. More likely, many traders, craftsmen, and bilingual intermediaries introduced signs over time. Greek communities adapted the script creatively, adding vowels and changing its use. But the myth of Cadmus gives a human shape to that process. A person is easier to remember than a network. Europa's story, too, reflects the imaginative pull of Phoenicia. The East is alluring, royal, dangerous, and generative. From it comes a figure who will be tied to the identity of a continent. For the Phoenicians themselves, these Greek myths may not have held the same meaning. They had their own stories, now mostly lost. But the Greek memory matters because it shows Phoenicia as a source of letters, a source of royal women, a source of mystery, a source of beginnings. When later Europeans wrote their histories, they often centered Greece and Rome, but even Greek myth looked eastward, toward the coast of Phoenicia, toward the harbors, toward the people who crossed the sea before them. Melkart, the great god of Tyre, traveled widely with Phoenician expansion. His name is often interpreted as king of the city, and he was closely associated with Tyrian identity, kingship, protection, renewal, and maritime expansion. When Greeks encountered Melkart, they identified him with Heracles, their own heroic divine figure known for strength, journeys, labors, and far western associations. This identification was more than a simple translation, it created a bridge. A Greek visiting a temple of Melkart might understand him through Heracles. A Phoenician honoring Melkart in a western colony might accept or use the Greek comparison in certain contexts. In places like Godir, where Melkart's temple became famous, Greek and later Roman interpretations helped weave Phoenician religion into the broader Mediterranean imagination. Gods traveled under many names, but for Phoenician settlers, Melkart's movement westward preserved a link to Tyre. A sanctuary of Melkart in a colony was like a spiritual harbor. It anchored the community to its origin and to the divine power that watched over the city and its voyages. Think of a merchant arriving at Godard after a dangerous journey. Before he visits the market, before he counts profit, before he boasts of survival, he goes to the sanctuary, he brings an offering. Perhaps incense, perhaps part of his gain, perhaps a small object promised in fear during a storm. The god has brought him through. Religion and commerce meet again, not because people were hypocritical, but because ancient life did not divide the sacred and economic as modern categories do. A successful voyage was both business and blessing. A failed voyage was both loss and possible divine displeasure. Melkart's western presence also helped define sacred geography. The far west was not merely a place of profit. It was a place where the god had arrived, and when Greeks imagined Heracles at the edge of the world, near the pillars that bore his name, they were entering a landscape already marked by Phoenician sacred memory. The gods, like the merchants, shared the sea. Phoenician religion included powerful goddesses whose influence reached across the Mediterranean. Astarte was one of the most important. She belonged to the wider West Semitic religious world and was associated in various contexts with sexuality, fertility, warfare, royal power, and protection. As Phoenician culture spread, forms of Astarte traveled with it and were interpreted through other religious systems, often compared with goddesses such as Aphrodite or Ishtar depending on context and perspective. In the Punic West, especially Carthage, Tanit became one of the most prominent divine figures. Tanit is strongly associated with Carthaginian religion, often appearing with Baal Hammon. Her symbol, sometimes called the sign of Tanit, appears on many Punic monuments and votive stelae. The exact origins and development of her cult remain debated, but her importance in Carthage is beyond question. To modernize, the sign of Tanit can appear simple: a triangle, a line, a circle, raised arms suggested in abstract form. But symbols do not need complexity to hold power. For the people who carved it, the sign marked devotion, identity, hope, and divine presence. A mother might pray, a sailor might vow, a family might dedicate, a city might honor. The feminine divine in Phoenician and Punic religion was not soft in a narrow sense. A goddess could protect, desire, bless, command, and terrify. She could stand beside kings and warriors. She could receive offerings from the anxious and the grateful. In the dim light of a sanctuary, gendered modern assumptions fade. What matters is power. The power to give life, the power to guard cities, the power to hear vows, the power to receive the dead. the power to cross the sea with her people. Astarte and Tanit remind us that Phoenician religion was not only the religion of merchants and sailors, but also of families, fertility, danger, mourning, and continuity. The sea carries ships, but women carry generations, and without generations, no colony becomes a civilization. There is one subject in Phoenician, and especially Punic religion, that requires great care: the Tophet. At Carthage and some other Punic sites, archaeologists have found sacred precincts containing urns with cremated remains of infants and young animals, along with stelae bearing religious symbols and inscriptions. Ancient Greek and Roman writers accused Carthaginians of child sacrifice, often in highly hostile and moralizing terms. For a long time, scholars debated whether these tophets were evidence of child sacrifice, cemeteries for infants who died naturally, or ritual spaces with more complex meanings. The debate has not always been calm. Some researchers emphasize the hostile nature of Greek and Roman sources, arguing that accusations may have been exaggerated as anti-Carthaginian propaganda. Others point to archaeological evidence, inscriptions, age patterns, and animal substitutions as support for the reality of ritual sacrifice in at least some cases. A careful historical position should avoid both extremes. We should not repeat enemy propaganda uncritically, but we should not dismiss material evidence simply because it is uncomfortable. Many specialists now consider it likely that child sacrifice did occur in some Punic contexts, though questions remain about frequency, social meaning, ritual interpretation, and variation over time and place. The practice, if and where it occurred, belonged to a religious worldview very different from modern moral assumptions. For this sleep narrative, we do not dwell on graphic detail, but we do not hide the past either. Ancient civilizations were capable of beauty and brutality at the same time. The same culture that gave the Mediterranean letters, trade, art, and cities could also practice rituals that disturb us deeply. This is not unique to Phoenicians or Carthaginians. Many ancient societies made offerings, sacrifices, and vows in ways that modern people find difficult to understand. History asks us to look steadily, not to excuse, not to sensationalize, but to understand that human beings have lived inside many moral worlds. The Tophet remains a place of silence. Urns beneath stone, names partly preserved, symbols carved for gods, questions still debated. It is one of the shadows in the Phoenician and Punic story. And shadows too belong to history. Death in the Phoenician world, as in all ancient worlds, was both personal and communal. Burial customs varied by region, period, status, and cultural influence. Inhumation and cremation both appear in different Phoenician and Punic contexts. Tombs could range from simple graves to elaborate rock-cut chambers or elite burials with imported goods. The dead were not simply disposed of. They were placed within meaning. A tomb might include pottery, jewelry, amulets, food offerings, weapons, cosmetic items, or objects connected to identity and status. Funerary inscriptions might warn against disturbance, name the deceased, invoke gods, or preserve family memory. The Phoenician funerary inscription can feel severe. It may speak to future readers, warning them not to open the resting place. It may call upon divine punishment for violators. This tells us something important. Tombs were vulnerable. The dead needed protection. Memory needed enforcement. Imagine a burial outside a city. The family gathers. The air is dry. A lamp burns. Someone weeps quietly. A priest or relative speaks words that have been spoken before. Objects are placed with care. The tomb is sealed. The living return to the city, carrying absence with them. Ancient death was close. Infant mortality was high. Disease, childbirth, shipwreck, war, accident, and famine all haunted life. A person did not need old age to know grief. And in a maritime culture, death could also mean disappearance. A ship that never returns leaves no body. A storm swallows not only men but rituals. Families wait, then wait longer, then understand. A grave may be empty, or symbolic, or never made. The sea gives wealth. The sea withholds closure. Perhaps this is why vows and gods mattered so deeply. To sail was to enter a place where burial itself could be denied. Because the records are limited, Phoenician women often appear to us through legend, elite inscriptions, or foreign stories. But even these fragments matter. Dido, or Elissa, the legendary founder of Carthage, is the most famous Phoenician woman in later literature. In Roman poetry, especially Virgil's Aeneid, she becomes a tragic queen whose love for Aeneas ends in abandonment and death, foreshadowing hostility between Rome and Carthage, but earlier traditions present her also as a clever and determined founder. She flees Tyre after political violence. She leads followers across the sea. She negotiates for land in North Africa. She establishes a city. Whether or not Dido reflects a historical founder, her legend preserves themes central to Phoenician identity: exile, maritime movement, political danger, negotiation, and the creation of a new city far from home. A woman becomes the embodiment of colonization. Europa, too, represents Phoenician womanhood in Greek imagination, though transformed through myth. She is carried westward and becomes associated with the naming of Europe. Like Dido, she is a figure of movement across the sea. These stories are shaped by male authors and foreign agendas, but they still reveal something. Phoenicia, in Mediterranean memory, was not only a land of merchants and sailors, it was also a land of royal women whose journeys changed the world. In real life, most women were not queens or princesses. They lived in households, workshops, farms, markets, temples, and colonies. They bore children, managed resources, performed rituals, mourned the dead, and helped carry culture across generations. A colony cannot survive with sailors alone. It requires families. It requires births. It requires kitchens, textiles, language, memory, and domestic gods. It requires women who make a foreign coast into a home. The history of expansion often speaks of ships, but settlement speaks of mothers. Punic, the Western form of Phoenician speech, endured long after the political fall of Carthage. This is one of the clearest signs that civilizations do not end when their capitals are destroyed. Rome could defeat Carthage. Rome could dismantle its fleet. Rome could take its territories. Rome could rebuild the city under Roman rule. But Rome could not instantly change the language of every village, household, and memory in North Africa. Punic continued to be spoken for centuries. Roman authors and later Christian writers refer to Punic language in North Africa. Augustine, who lived in the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD in Roman North Africa, shows awareness of Punic speech among local populations. By his time, Latin was dominant in official and literary contexts, but Punic had not entirely disappeared. A language can retreat without vanishing. It may leave cities first and survive in rural areas. It may remain in names. It may persist in prayers. It may be spoken by grandparents more than children. It may become associated with local identity rather than political power. The fading of Punic was probably slow. One generation speaks it fully. The next understands but answers in Latin. The next remembers only names, curses, songs, or phrases. Eventually, the language becomes a ghost inside place names and inscriptions. This process has happened many times in human history. Language loss is quiet. No army needs to burn a library. A mother simply stops teaching a word because another language offers more opportunity. A child laughs at an old pronunciation. A market shifts. A church uses another tongue. An official record ignores the speech of home. And slowly, a world grows silent. Yet because Phoenician gave so much to later alphabets, its silence is not complete. The spoken language faded, but the idea of alphabetic writing flourished. The voice disappeared. The letters survived through descendants. Phoenician cities appear in biblical texts, especially Tyre and Sidon. These references are important, but must be understood within the theological, political, and literary purposes of the biblical writers. The Bible is not a neutral Phoenician history. It preserves memories of trade, diplomacy, marriage alliances, religious conflict, luxury, and prophetic critique. The relationship between Israelite and Phoenician worlds was close and complex. They were neighbors. Their languages were related. Their cultures shared older Canaanite roots. They traded with one another. They also differed in religious identity and political destiny. The biblical accounts of King Hiram of Tyre and King Solomon describe cooperation in building projects, especially the supply of cedar and skilled labor. These stories reflect a plausible broader reality. Phoenician timber and craftsmanship were highly valued by inland kingdoms. But other biblical texts criticize Tyre and Sidon as symbols of pride, wealth, luxury, and foreign religious influence. Jezebel, associated with Sidon through biblical tradition, becomes a powerful and negative figure in the narrative of Israelite religion and politics. Prophetic texts against Tyre are especially vivid. They imagine the city as a wealthy merchant ship, or a proud trading power, brought low by divine judgment. From the biblical perspective, Phoenician wealth could appear dangerous. Trade brought luxury. Luxury brought pride. Foreign gods brought corruption. The sea city became a moral symbol. For historians, these texts are valuable, but must be read carefully. They also preserve clues about economic relations, political alliances, and the fame of Tyre. But they do not give us the Phoenicians' own self-description. Again, we see them through another people's mirror. A mirror sharpened by theology. A mirror darkened by rivalry. A mirror illuminated by real contact. Egypt's relationship with the Levant was ancient. Long before the Phoenician cities rose to their first millennium prominence, Egypt had traded with and exerted influence over coastal Canaanite cities. Byblos in particular maintained deep connections with Egypt, especially through the timber trade. Egypt needed wood. The Nile Valley produced many things, but large, high-quality timber was not abundant in the same way as in Lebanon. Cedar from the Levant was therefore prized. Egyptian texts and objects show the importance of exchange with Byblos and other coastal regions. Egyptian influence flowed northward too. Scarabs, amulets, artistic motifs, religious symbols, and prestige objects traveled into the Levant. Local elites used Egyptian styles to express status, but influence did not mean simple domination at all times. Coastal cities could adopt Egyptian forms while maintaining their own identity. This was a familiar Phoenician pattern before the name Phoenician was even used. Receive, adapt, trade, translate. From the Egyptian viewpoint, the coast of Lebanon was a source of timber, skilled partners, and strategic concern. From the coastal viewpoint, Egypt was a wealthy market, a powerful neighbor, and a source of prestige. Imagine an Egyptian official receiving cedar beams from Byblos. The wood smells foreign and sacred. It has crossed the sea. It will become part of a temple, a boat, a tomb, or a palace. It carries the mountains of Lebanon into the ritual heart of Egypt. Trade makes landscapes travel. A tree grown in misty highlands can become a beam above a desert sanctuary. A shell gathered from a rocky Phoenician shore can become purple cloth in a royal court. A letter shaped in a Levantine city can become a sign in a Greek inscription. The Phoenicians lived by moving pieces of the world into new meanings. Let us now spend one full imagined day in Tyre. Not a day of siege, not a day of royal ceremony, not a day remembered by historians, just a day. Before dawn, the island is dark. Only a few lamps burn near the harbour and temple precincts. The sea is black and breathing. The mainland is a deeper shadow beyond the water. Somewhere, a rooster calls from a courtyard. Somewhere, a child turns in sleep. The first workers rise. A woman stirs embers and prepares bread. A man checks a storage jar. A young apprentice walks to the quay, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. A priest washes before morning rites. A guard opens a gate. As light grows, the harbour becomes visible. Ships lie crowded together, their masts like a bare winter forest. Some are small coastal vessels, others are broader merchant ships prepared for longer routes. A warship rests apart, leaner, more disciplined, its oars drawn in. The first voices are low, then louder. A merchant argues about damaged pottery. A sailor laughs too sharply at a joke. A fisherman curses a tangled net. A donkey refuses to move. A scribe asks for silence so he can count properly. The city wakes in layers. In the market, baskets appear. Fish, onions, figs, oil, grain, rough cloth, beads, tools, lamps, small amulets, imported objects, local goods. Women inspect quality. Men exaggerate value. Children run errands. Foreigners watch carefully, not wanting to be cheated. By mid-morning, the workshops are alive. In one place, metal is hammered. In another, ivory is carved. In another, glass or faience-like objects gleam under skilled hands. Near the dying quarter, the smell grows powerful. Workers endure what elites prefer not to imagine. At noon, heat presses down. The streets narrow into shade. Animals seek stillness. Some work slows. The sea flashes too brightly to look at for long. In upper rooms, people rest or speak quietly. Afternoon brings business again. A ship from Cyprus arrives. Copper is discussed. News travels faster than cargo. Someone has heard of trouble near Sicily. Someone else says silver prices in the West are changing. A priest hears a vow from a captain who survived a storm. A family receives word that a relative will not return until the next season. Evening softens the city. The harsh smells remain, but the light makes everything beautiful. Stone walls turn gold, water darkens to blue, voices become warmer, food is prepared, rooftops fill with people escaping the heat of the rooms below. At night, lamps appear, the city contracts into circles of light, stories are told, accounts are reviewed, children sleep, the harbour still watches, and beyond the harbour, invisible in darkness, lies the road that made Tyre rich. The sea. Now let us cross time and water. We are in Carthage, centuries after the first settlers came from Tyre. The city is larger, broader, more powerful. The air is North African. The light is wider. The land around the city carries fields, estates, roads, and villages. The harbour is disciplined, strategic, and immense in purpose. At dawn, Carthage does not feel like a daughter anymore. It feels like a capital. Ships move through its harbours. Officials conduct business. Magistrates prepare for meetings. Priests tend sanctuaries. Merchants calculate profits from Iberia, Sardinia, Sicily, and Africa. Farm produce moves towards storage. Soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, slaves, foreign traders, local Libyans, Punic citizens, and envoys all contribute to the city's rhythm. Carthage is not merely Phoenician. It is Punic. A new thing, born from an old thing. Its language still carries the eastern root. Its gods still remember the Levant. Its elite families may trace pride back to Tyrian origins, but the city's reality is Western. North African land feeds it. Iberian silver strengthens it. Sardinian and Sicilian struggles shape it. Rome increasingly threatens it. In the marketplace, one hears many identities. A Punic merchant from an old family. A Libyan farmer bringing produce. A Sardinian sailor. An Iberian soldier. A Greek trader watched with suspicion. A Roman envoy measuring everything with cold interest. Carthage is a city of accumulation. Accumulated wealth. Accumulated resentment. Accumulated memory. Accumulated fear. It carries Tyre within it, but it also carries its own destiny. And destiny, for Carthage, will become fire, but not yet. For now, in this imagined day, the city still stands. The harbour is full. The temples receive offerings. The council debates. The sea remains open, and somewhere, perhaps, a child learns letters descended from the same signs once carved in the East. The Phoenicians often feel mysterious to modern audiences. But mystery is not always created by secrecy. Sometimes it is created by loss. We have Greek voices. We have Roman voices. We have Egyptian monuments. We have Mesopotamian tablets. We have Hebrew scriptures. We have Persian inscriptions. But we do not have a great surviving Phoenician library telling the story from within. This absence gives them a shadowed quality. They appear in other people's records as traders, craftsmen, sailors, tribute bearers, rivals, colonists, and enemies. They appear in archaeology as pottery, harbour installations, inscriptions, dye works, tombs, and scattered goods. They appear in our own alphabet as distant ancestors of signs, but they rarely sit down and speak to us directly for pages and pages. So we must reconstruct. And reconstruction requires humility. We should not fill every silence with fantasy. We should not treat every Greek accusation as truth. We should not romanticize them as peaceful merchants without conflict. We should not reduce them to Carthage alone. We should not imagine them as one unified nation-state. They were city people, sea people, Canaanite-rooted people, diaspora people, practical people, religious people, artistic people, sometimes violent people, often vulnerable people. They were human, and perhaps their mystery comes from the fact that they shaped history, without leaving the kind of self-celebrating monuments later civilizations used to dominate memory. They did not need to carve their greatness into one desert cliff. They carved it into roots. Roots are harder to see, but they can last longer than stone. Before the Phoenicians, the Mediterranean was already connected. Minoans, Mycenaeans, Egyptians, Cypriots, Canaanites, Anatolians, and many others had sailed and traded across it. The Phoenicians did not invent Mediterranean exchange, but they intensified it after the Bronze Age collapse. They helped rebuild connection when older palace systems had fractured. They carried eastern goods westward and western metals eastward. They made permanent settlements across the sea. They linked local communities into wider circuits. They spread an alphabetic script whose influence would outgrow them. They made the Mediterranean smaller. Not physically, emotionally, commercially, culturally. A merchant in Tyre could think of Spain. A settler in Carthage could remember Lebanon. A Greek adapting letters could unknowingly inherit Levantine signs. A Roman fighting Carthage could be pulled into a conflict rooted in Phoenician expansion centuries earlier. The Mediterranean became a space where no shore was completely alone. This is perhaps the deepest Phoenician achievement. They did not simply move across the sea. They taught the sea to remember. Every colony was a memory point, every harbour a node, every inscription a trace, every god carried westward a thread back east, every cargo connected two landscapes. The Mediterranean of Greece and Rome was built partly on Phoenician routes. The later world sailed through channels they had helped open. Now, as we move toward the end of this long journey, let everything become quiet again. Let the battles fade first. Let Rome recede. Let Hannibal's elephants disappear into mountain mist. Let the burning of Carthage soften into distant smoke. Let Alexander's siege engines fall silent. Let Assyrian envoys, Persian fleets, Greek rivals, and Roman senators withdraw into shadow. Return instead to the simple image of a ship. A cedar ship at dawn, its hull dark with pitch, its sails still tied, its cargo waiting, its crew sleepy but alert, its captain watching the wind, its city behind it, its road ahead invisible. This is Phoenicia. Not only war, not only trade, not only alphabet, not only purple, not only Carthage, a ship between mountain and sea. Behind it, a narrow homeland with cedar forests, crowded cities, workshops, temples and families. Ahead of it, Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, Iberia, the Atlantic threshold, and all the uncertain distances of the ancient world. The Phoenicians lived in the space between limitation and possibility. Their land was narrow, so they widened it with routes. Their cities were small, so they multiplied them overseas. Their political power was often constrained, so they built influence through trade. Their script was simple, so it traveled farther than monuments. Their homeland was vulnerable, so their culture learned to survive in fragments. They remind us that history is not always made by the largest territory. Sometimes it is made by those who connect territories, not by those who own the most land, but by those who know the roads between lands. The Phoenicians knew the roads of water, and because they knew them, the ancient Mediterranean changed. The night is deep now. The old harbour is almost still. Only the water continues its patient movement. A few stars remain above the dark line of the mountains. A faint wind moves through ropes and folded sails. Somewhere, far out beyond the harbour mouth, a ship is already gone, its stern lamp no longer visible from shore. Perhaps it is sailing toward Cyprus, perhaps toward Egypt, perhaps toward Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage, or Gadara. Perhaps it will return with silver, copper, ivory, grain, glass, stories, or sorrow. Perhaps it will not return at all. The city waits, as port cities always wait. Waiting is part of the sea. Families wait. Merchants wait. Priests wait. Creditors wait. Children wait for fathers whose faces blur with time. Old sailors wait for younger men to learn what they once knew. Gods wait in the smoke of temples. And history waits too. It waits beneath the streets of modern cities. It waits under the water where wrecks lie broken and silent. It waits in inscriptions half erased by wind. It waits in the shapes of letters you can still recognize without knowing why. It waits in the name of Carthage. It waits in the memory of Tyre. It waits in the word purple. It waits in every alphabet descended, however distantly, from those old coastal signs. The Phoenicians are gone, and not gone. Their cities changed, their language faded, their gods were renamed, absorbed, forgotten, or transformed. Their colonies became ruins, Roman cities, modern towns, archaeological sites, and legends, but the sea they crossed remains. The Mediterranean still touches Lebanon, Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, Tunisia, Spain, and countless shores between. The same moon still lays silver on the water. The same stars still rise over sailors. The same wind still enters harbours at night. And somewhere in that wind, if we listen gently, there is an echo, oars in darkness, ropes tightening, a scribe marking a name, a dyer watching purple deepen, a mother looking toward the harbour, a merchant whispering a prayer, a cedar ship turning west. Let that image carry you now, across the quiet water, past the island lights, past Cyprus, past Sicily, past Carthage before its fall, past Gadara at the edge of the known world. Beyond ambition, beyond empire, beyond the noise of history, only the sea remains, and the soft movement of a ship beneath the stars. So rest now. Let the ancient coast fade. Let the harbour lamps grow dim. Let the purple dark of the Mediterranean settle around you like a calm and endless night. And as you drift, remember the people who made roads from water, letters from sound, wealth from shells, cities from harbours, and memory from movement. The Phoenicians, sailors of the old world, merchants of the purple shore, keepers of routes between mountain and sea. Good night.